I said move her now or I'll have this entire airline shut down by morning. The shriek echoed through the first-class cabin of Flight 847, cutting through the gentle hum of the auxiliary power unit, like a blade through silk. The storm clouds gathering over JFK International Airport seemed almost gentle compared to the tempest brewing in the mind of Victoria Blackwood. At 55, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had never heard the word no without immediately reaching for her checkbook or her lawyer's phone number. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back into a severe chignon that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her cream-colored Hermès suit probably could have funded a small school's library for a year. Victoria tapped her diamond-encrusted Cartier watch against her Louis Vuitton, clutched the sound, creating a sharp staccato rhythm that made the young mother nearby flinch and pull her toddler closer. The departure lounge at JFK was buzzing with the usual afternoon energy, but Victoria's presence seemed to create a bubble of tension that expanded outward, like ripples in a pond. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she muttered loud enough for anyone within a 10-foot radius to hear her voice carrying that particular blend of entitlement and irritation that could make service workers develop stress headaches just from proximity. "Priority boarding was supposed to commence 4 minutes ago, and I have a very important engagement in London that cannot be delayed." The gate agent, a harried-looking man named David, who had been dealing with delayed flights and cranky passengers for the past 6 hours, picked up his microphone with the weary resignation of someone who knew that whatever he said next would probably result in at least 3 more complaints to corporate. Victoria didn't wait for him to finish his announcement about inviting first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members to board Flight 847 to London Heathrow. She surged forward like a guided missile, cutting off a distinguished businessman in a perfectly tailored gray suit who had been waiting patiently in the designated priority line. Her heels clicked against the polished terrazzo floor with the aggressive precision of a metronome set to a tempo that suggested someone was perpetually late for something incredibly important. She slammed her boarding pass onto the scanner with such force that David actually jumped, then marched down the jet bridge without so much as acknowledging his existence. Victoria Blackwood was the kind of woman who had built her entire identity around the fortune her late husband had left her 2 years ago. Dr. Richard Blackwood had been a brilliant tech entrepreneur who had revolutionized data security systems, but more importantly, from Victoria's perspective, he had also been worth approximately $400 million. When a sudden heart attack claimed him during what should have been a routine business dinner. The grief had lasted about as long as it took for the will to be read, and ever since then, Victoria had been wielding her inherited wealth like a sword, cutting through any inconvenience or obstacle that dared to present itself in her path. She had learned quickly that money could indeed buy happiness, as long as your definition of happiness included never having to wait in line, never having to accept substandard service, and never having to tolerate the presence of people who didn't meet her increasingly specific standards of worthiness. Her social circle had dwindled to include only those who could match her financial status or provide her with access to even more exclusive experiences, and she had developed a particular talent for making service industry workers question their life choices with nothing more than a perfectly timed sigh and a withering look. As Victoria entered the aircraft, the soft, ambient lighting of the first-class cabin was designed to create a sense of luxury and tranquility, but it did little to soothe the irritation that seemed to be her default emotional state. The new Boeing 777 featured spacious suites with sliding doors for privacy, each one appointed with cream leather seats that could fully recline into beds, personal entertainment systems, with screens larger than many people's first televisions and enough storage space for the kind of carry-on luggage that cost more than most people's cars. Victoria was assigned to seat 1B, a window suite that offered both privacy and the kind of unobstructed view that would allow her to look down on the world quite literally as well as figuratively. She had specifically requested this seat because she had read in a travel blog that it was considered the most prestigious position in the cabin, and Victoria was the kind of person who researched these things with the dedication of a scholar preparing for comprehensive exams. But as she approached her row, Victoria stopped dead in her tracks, her perfectly manicured hand gripping the handle of her designer luggage so tightly that her knuckles went white against her pale skin. There, sitting calmly in seat 1. With the partition between their suites currently lowered, was a black woman who appeared to be in her early 70s, dressed in a simple navy blue cardigan that looked like it might have come from a department store rather than a boutique, paired with gray slacks that were clean and pressed but clearly not designer. The woman's silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun that emphasized the elegant bone structure of her face, and she was reading a worn paperback book, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been wearing them for years. She looked completely at ease, utterly comfortable in her surroundings, and totally oblivious to the fact that her presence had just triggered what would soon become the most expensive tantrum in commercial aviation history. Victoria stared at this unexpected occupant of the adjacent seat, her mind racing through possibilities and explanations, none of which seemed to make sense to her carefully constructed world view. In her experience, first-class cabins were populated by people who looked like her people, who shared her background and her assumptions about who belonged where in the social hierarchy. The presence of this quietly dignified woman in what Victoria considered to be her exclusive space felt like a personal affront, a violation of the natural order that her money was supposed to guarantee. Grace Washington had learned long ago that the best way to observe the true character of people was to make yourself invisible, to blend into the background so completely that others forgot to perform their carefully rehearsed versions of themselves. At 70, she had perfected this art to the point where she could sit in the most exclusive spaces in the world and watch as people revealed who they really were when they thought no one important was watching. She had chosen her outfit for this flight with the same careful consideration that generals gave to battlefield strategy, understanding that her simple navy cardigan and comfortable gray slacks would render her essentially invisible to the kind of people who judged worth by designer labels and price tags. The worn paperback in her hands was a first edition of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird, sings a book that had traveled with her on countless flights over the past 4 decades, its pages soft and familiar beneath her fingertips. Grace had been making this particular journey from New York to London for 40 years, ever since she had first taken control of a failing airline that was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured fuel tank. Back then, Horizon Airways had consisted of 3 aging aircraft, a mountain of debt that would have given financial advisors nightmares, and a reputation for delayed flights and customer service that could charitably be described as indifferent. She had been a 30-year-old widow, then still reeling from the sudden loss of her husband Samuel in a car accident that had left her with a 2-year-old daughter, a modest life insurance payout, and a burning desire to build something that would matter. When the opportunity to purchase the airline had presented itself, every financial advisor she consulted had told her she was crazy, that she would lose everything, that the aviation industry was no place for a young black woman with more determination than capital. But Grace Washington had never been the kind of person who let other people's limitations define her possibilities. She had liquidated every asset she owned, borrowed against her future, and purchased not just the airline, but the dream of what it could become. She had spent the next 4 decades building Horizon Airways into one of the most respected carriers in the world, known not just for its safety record and on-time performance, but for its revolutionary approach to treating every passenger with dignity, regardless of their ticket price or social status. The irony was not lost on her that she now owned the very airplane she was sitting in, that every person working on this flight ultimately answered to her, and that the woman who was currently staring at her with obvious displeasure had paid $12,000 for the privilege of sitting next to someone who could buy and sell her family's fortune several times over. But Grace had learned that real power was most effective when it remained hidden, when people underestimated you so completely that they revealed their true nature without any pretense or careful consideration. Today's flight held special significance beyond her usual business travel. It was the 40th anniversary of Samuel's death, and this route from New York to London had been planned as their delayed honeymoon, the trip they had postponed while building their life together and never managed to take before fate intervened. Every year on this date, Grace took this flight as a way of honoring his memory and completing the journey they had planned to take together. She had deliberately chosen to fly commercial rather than taking her private jet, and had booked under her married name rather than the corporate identity that would have triggered the kind of VIP treatment that would have insulated her from the real experiences of her passengers. This annual pilgrimage allowed her to see how her company actually operated when the CEO wasn't watching, to observe how her employees treated customers, and to ensure that the values she had built into the foundation of Horizon Airways were still alive and well at 30,000 feet. The other passengers in the first-class cabin represented a typical cross-section of the kind of people who could afford premium air travel. In seat 2B sat Marcus Chen, a tech entrepreneur in his early 40s who had made his fortune developing educational software and was traveling to London to finalize a partnership with Oxford University. His hoodie might have looked casual to the untrained eye, but Grace recognized it as the kind of deliberately understated luxury that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Across the aisle in seat 3, a Rebecca Martinez was studying architectural plans on her tablet, occasionally making notes in the margins with a stylus that moved with the precision of someone who had spent years designing buildings that would outlast their creators. She was flying to London to present her designs for a new sustainable housing complex, and her quiet intensity suggested someone who took her work seriously enough to prepare even during a transcontinental flight. The young family in seats 2C and 2D consisted of David and Jennifer Thompson, traveling with their 18-month-old daughter Emma to visit Jennifer's parents who had relocated to London after David's tech company had been acquired by a British firm. They were the kind of passengers who apologized profusely for their child's every sound, even though Emma was actually being remarkably well-behaved for someone who was too young to understand why she was strapped into a chair surrounded by strangers. Grace watched these interactions with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades studying human behavior, noting how people revealed their character through small gestures and unconscious habits. She had learned that you could tell more about a person's true nature by watching how they treated the flight attendant serving their drinks than by reading their resume or their bank statement. The flight crew was led by Maya Peterson, a young woman in her late 20s who had joined Horizon Airways straight out of college and had quickly distinguished herself as someone who understood that excellent service came from genuine care rather than scripted responses. Maya had the kind of natural warmth that put nervous flyers at ease and the professional competence that earned the respect of even the most demanding passengers. As Grace turned a page in her book, she became aware of someone staring at her with an intensity that felt almost physical. She looked up to see a woman in an expensive cream-colored suit standing in the aisle, her face twisted into an expression of barely contained outrage that suggested someone had just informed her that her platinum credit card had been declined at a charity auction. Captain James Rodriguez had been flying for Horizon Airways for 25 years, and in that time he had developed the kind of instinctive understanding of his aircraft that allowed him to sense problems before the instruments did, and navigate through challenges that would have grounded less experienced pilots. At 52, he carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had earned the respect of his crews not through intimidation or hierarchy, but through competence and the kind of steady leadership that made people feel safe even when the weather was trying to tear the wings off the plane. This morning's pre-flight routine had proceeded with the methodical precision that had become second nature over the course of more than 15,000 flight hours. James had arrived at the airport 2 hours before departure, allowing himself time for the thorough aircraft inspection that he insisted on conducting personally, regardless of how many mechanics had already signed off on the plane's airworthiness. He had walked around the Boeing 777 checking everything from tire pressure to the alignment of control surfaces, looking for the kind of subtle anomalies that could only be detected by someone who understood that aviation safety was built on attention to details that might seem insignificant to the untrained eye. The crew briefing had taken place in the operations center, a windowless room filled with weather displays, route maps, and the constant chatter of radio communications that formed the nervous system of airport operations. James had reviewed the flight plan with his first officer, Sarah Kim, a brilliant pilot in her early 30s, who was working toward her captain certification and had already demonstrated the kind of judgment and skill that suggested she would be commanding her own flights within the next 2 years. They had discussed the weather forecast for their route, noting the storm system that was currently moving through the New York area and the clear skies that awaited them over the Atlantic. James had made the decision to request a slightly delayed departure to allow the worst of the turbulence to pass, a choice that would add 20 minutes to their schedule, but would ensure that their passengers experienced the kind of smooth flight that made people forget they were hurtling through the sky at 500 miles per hour. The cabin crew briefing had included Maya Peterson, the lead flight attendant, whose natural warmth and professional competence had earned her recognition as one of the airline's most valued team members. Maya had joined Horizon Airways straight out of college 5 years ago, and James had watched her develop from an eager but inexperienced young woman into someone who could handle any situation from medical emergencies to unruly passengers with equal skill and grace. During the briefing, James had emphasized the importance of treating every passenger with respect, regardless of their ticket price or apparent social status, a principle that was built into the foundation of Horizon Airways' training program. He had learned early in his career that the aviation industry had a tendency to create hierarchies based on wealth rather than human worth, and he had made it his personal mission to ensure that his flights operated according to different principles. What James didn't know as he conducted his routine preparations was that today's passenger manifest included someone whose name would have caused him to approach this flight with an entirely different level of attention. Grace Washington had booked her ticket under her married name, a practice that allowed her to travel without the kind of VIP treatment that would have isolated her from the real passenger experience. If James had known that the founder and majority owner of Horizon Airways was sitting in seat 1A, he would have recognized the significance of this particular date and understood why this flight represented much more than routine business travel. 25 years ago, James Rodriguez had been a young pilot struggling to find work in an industry that seemed determined to keep him grounded. He had been fired from his previous position at a regional carrier for refusing to fly an aircraft with a faulty engine, a decision that had been vindicated when that same plane was later grounded for the exact problem he had identified. But vindication didn't pay the bills or feed his young family, and James had spent months applying for positions only to be told that his attitude made him unsuitable for commercial aviation. Grace Washington had personally interviewed James for his position at Horizon Airways, and she had listened to his story about refusing to compromise safety for schedule with the kind of attention that suggested she understood the difference between insubordination and integrity. She had hired him on the spot, telling him that she was building an airline that valued pilots who would choose safety over convenience, who would stand up for what was right even when it cost them personally. Over the years, James had occasionally wondered about the woman who had given him his second chance in aviation, but Grace Washington had maintained such a low profile that few employees ever saw her outside of official company functions. He knew that she remained actively involved in the airline's operations, but she had delegated most of the day-to-day management to a team of executives who shared her vision of what commercial aviation could become. As James completed his final checks and prepared to welcome the passengers aboard, he had no idea that this flight would test everything he had learned about leadership integrity and the courage required to do the right thing when powerful people demanded otherwise. The storm clouds gathering outside seemed almost gentle compared to the conflict that was about to erupt in the first-class cabin. a confrontation that would force him to choose between appeasing a wealthy passenger and protecting the values that had defined his career. The passenger manifest showed a full flight, including several high-profile travelers in first class who would expect the kind of seamless service that Horizon Airways had built its reputation on delivering. James had learned over the years that wealthy passengers often came with their own unique challenges, that money had a way of amplifying both the best and worst aspects of human nature, and that his job sometimes required him to navigate between competing demands while maintaining the kind of professional standards that kept everyone safe. As he settled into the captain's seat and began the final system checks that would clear them for departure, James felt the familiar sense of responsibility that came with commanding an aircraft carrying 280 passengers across the Atlantic Ocean. Each of those people had trusted him with their lives, and he had spent his entire career ensuring that trust was never misplaced. The transformation in Victoria Blackwood's demeanor was immediate and dramatic, like watching a perfectly controlled mask slip to reveal the seething resentment that had been building underneath. Her carefully maintained composure cracked like expensive porcelain hitting concrete, and what emerged was the kind of raw entitlement that money could buy, but civilization was supposed to temper. "Excuse me." Victoria's voice cut through the gentle ambient noise of the cabin with the precision of a scalpel, though her tone suggested that she had no intention of actually excusing anything. She positioned herself directly in front of Grace's seat, her designer handbag clutched in her manicured fingers, like a weapon she was prepared to deploy. "I believe there's been some kind of mistake." Grace looked up from her book, slowly removing her reading glasses with the deliberate care of someone who had learned that rapid movements often escalated situations that could be resolved with patience and measured responses. Her dark eyes met Victoria's pale blue ones with a steady gaze that revealed nothing about the thoughts racing through her mind, though anyone who knew Grace well would have recognized the subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested she was processing far more information than she was revealing. "I'm sorry," Grace replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from decades of navigating difficult conversations with people who mistook wealth for wisdom. "Is there something I can help you with?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless, the kind of sound that made other passengers turn their heads and wonder if they should be reaching for their phones to record whatever was about to unfold. "Help me?" "Yes. Actually, you can help me by explaining what you're doing in my space." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire, carrying implications that made the other first-class passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus Chen looked up from his laptop, his fingers pausing over the keyboard as he processed what he had just heard. Rebecca Martinez glanced up from her architectural plans, her eyebrows rising slightly as she recognized the tone of someone who was about to make everyone else's flight significantly more uncomfortable. "This is seat 1. Grace responded with the kind of measured patience that suggested she had dealt with difficult people before, and had learned that responding to aggression with escalation rarely improved anyone's situation. "According to my boarding pass, this is where I'm supposed to be sitting." Victoria's face began to flush with the kind of angry red that clashed horribly with her expensive foundation, creating a mottled appearance that no amount of costly skincare could prevent. "I don't care what your boarding pass says," she snapped, her voice rising to a level that was beginning to attract attention from the economy class passengers who were still boarding behind her. "I paid $12,000 for this ticket, and I expect to be surrounded by people who belong in first class." The silence that followed was the kind of heavy quiet that settles over a room when someone has said something so obviously inappropriate that everyone present needs a moment to process the magnitude of the social violation they have just witnessed. Maya Peterson, who had been checking the overhead bins to ensure that passengers had properly stored their luggage, froze in place as she realized that she was about to deal with the kind of situation that airline training courses covered in theory, but that most flight attendants hoped they would never encounter in practice. Ma'am Maya approached with the kind of professional smile that was designed to de-escalate tensions while maintaining appropriate boundaries. "Is there a problem with your seating assignment? I'd be happy to review your boarding pass and help resolve any confusion." Victoria whirled around to face the young flight attendant with the kind of fury that suggested someone had just informed her that her membership at the country club had been revoked for public intoxication. "The problem," she said, jabbing her finger in Grace's direction with the precision of someone identifying a bug that needed to be removed from an otherwise perfect salad, "is that this woman clearly doesn't belong here. Look at her." The request was delivered with the confident expectation that anyone with eyes would immediately understand what Victoria was talking about, that the evidence of Grace's unworthiness was so obvious that it didn't require further explanation. Her gaze swept over Grace's simple clothing and comfortable shoes with the kind of disdain usually reserved for finding expired milk in the refrigerator. "I can see that she's a passenger with a valid ticket," Maya replied, her voice maintaining its professional warmth despite the growing tension that was making her stomach clench with anxiety. "Mrs. Washington has just as much right to be here as any other first-class passenger." The use of Grace's name seemed to startle Victoria, as if the idea that this woman might have an identity beyond being an obstacle to Victoria's comfort had never occurred to her. "Washington," she repeated, her voice dripping with the kind of skepticism that suggested she suspected Maya of making up names just to be difficult. "How convenient. Did she win some kind of lottery? Is this part of some diversity program?" Grace closed her book and placed it carefully on her tray table, her movements still deliberate and controlled despite the fact that she was being discussed as if she weren't sitting right there listening to every word. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make Victoria's eyes narrow with suspicion. "I understand you're concerned about your comfort during this flight, but I assure you that my presence here is entirely legitimate." The fact that Grace knew her name seemed to catch Victoria off guard, though she recovered quickly with the kind of aggressive defensiveness that wealthy people often employed when they suspected they were being made fun of by people they considered their inferiors. "How do you know my name? Have you been researching me? Are you some kind of reporter trying to ambush me?" "Your name is on the passenger manifest," Grace explained with the patient tone of someone addressing a child who was having difficulty understanding a simple concept. "And I believe you mentioned it when you were discussing your various concerns with the gate agent downstairs." Maya Peterson found herself in the increasingly uncomfortable position of trying to mediate between a passenger who seemed determined to create a scene and another passenger who was maintaining an almost supernatural level of calm in the face of increasingly personal attacks. Her training had covered difficult passengers, but most of the scenarios had involved people who were drunk or afraid of flying, not someone who appeared to be having a public meltdown over the mere presence of another human being. "Mrs. Blackwood," Maya tried again. "Perhaps if you'd like to take your seat, we can discuss any concerns you might have about the cabin arrangement once we are airborne. I'm sure we can find a solution that makes everyone comfortable." Victoria's response was immediate and volcanic. "I will not take my seat until this situation is resolved to my satisfaction," she declared, her voice now loud enough to be heard clearly in the economy section where passengers were beginning to crane their necks to see what was causing the commotion. "I demand to speak to the captain immediately. This is a security issue." The word security seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, transforming what had been an awkward social situation into something that could potentially delay the flight and involve law enforcement. Maya felt her professional composure beginning to strain as she realized that this situation was escalating beyond her ability to resolve through customer service techniques. Grace Washington sat quietly through this exchange, her hands folded in her lap, watching Victoria's performance with the kind of detached interest that an anthropologist might show while observing the behavior of a particularly aggressive specimen in its natural habitat. She had seen this kind of behavior before, had dealt with people who believed that their money gave them the right to treat others as less than human. But it never ceased to amaze her how some people could reach middle age without learning the basic social skills that most children mastered by kindergarten. The first-class cabin had become an impromptu theater, with Victoria Blackwood holding center stage in what was rapidly becoming a performance piece titled How to Destroy Your Reputation in Real Time. The other passengers had abandoned any pretense of minding their own business, their expensive meals and premium entertainment systems forgotten as they watched what was beginning to look like a master class in how privilege could corrupt basic human decency. "I want her removed from this aircraft immediately," Victoria announced, her voice carrying the kind of imperial authority that suggested she expected flight attendants to snap to attention and execute her commands without question. "I don't care if you have to call security, I don't care if you have to delay the flight, and I frankly don't care if she paid for her ticket with monopoly money. She does not belong here." Grace Washington continued to sit quietly, her posture straight, but relaxed, her hands still folded in her lap, with the kind of composure that came from decades of dealing with people who mistook volume for validity. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft enough that everyone in the cabin had to lean forward slightly to hear her, which somehow made her words carry more weight than Victoria's shouting. Mrs. Blackwood Grace said, her tone carrying the kind of gentle authority that good teachers used when correcting a student who had made an embarrassing mistake in front of the class. "I'm curious about something. What exactly do you think gives you the right to determine who belongs where?" The question seemed to catch Victoria off guard, as if the idea that her authority might be questioned was so foreign to her experience that she needed a moment to process it. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to formulate a response that consisted mostly of sputtered indignation and references to her late husband's business accomplishments. "My husband built half the tech infrastructure in Silicon Valley," Victoria declared, pulling herself up to her full height and gesturing expansively as if she were addressing a board of directors rather than a captive audience of airline passengers. "We have contributed millions to charity. We have supported countless politicians, and we have earned the right to expect a certain level of exclusivity when we pay for premium services." Earned, Grace repeated, seeming to taste the word as if it were an unfamiliar flavor. "That's an interesting choice of words. Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood, what exactly did you personally earn beyond the accident of marriage?" The question hit Victoria like a slap, causing her to take a step backward, as if she had been physically struck. Her face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a color that could charitably be described as burgundy. "How dare you!" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you question my accomplishments?" "I'm not questioning your accomplishments," Grace replied with the same calm tone she might have used to discuss the weather. "I'm simply asking what they are, since everything you've mentioned so far seems to have been achieved by your late husband rather than yourself." Maya Peterson watched this exchange with growing concern, recognizing that she was witnessing something that went far beyond a simple seating dispute. There was an undercurrent of power in Grace's quiet responses that seemed to unsettle Victoria in ways that all the shouting and threats couldn't achieve. Maya had been trained to de-escalate conflicts, but this felt less like a customer service issue and more like watching a chess master quietly dismantle an opponent who didn't realize the game had already been won. Marcus Chen had given up any pretense of working on his laptop and was now openly staring at the confrontation with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or train wrecks. As someone who had built his own tech company from the ground up, he found himself oddly impressed by Grace's ability to maintain her composure while systematically dismantling Victoria's arguments with surgical precision. "This is ridiculous," Victoria announced, though her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "I shouldn't have to justify myself to someone who probably bought her ticket with food stamps." The comment drew audible gasps from several passengers and caused Maya Peterson to close her eyes briefly, as she realized that this situation had just crossed a line that would make it impossible to resolve quietly. Grace Washington's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of her stillness, like the moment before a storm, when the air pressure drops and animals begin seeking shelter. When she spoke again, her voice was still quiet, but it carried an undertone of steel that made everyone in the cabin suddenly aware that they were witnessing something significant. Mrs. Blackwood Grace said, rising slowly from her seat with the kind of dignified grace that comes from a lifetime of carrying oneself with purpose, "You seem to be operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about how the world actually works. You appear to believe that your money makes you important, that your husband's accomplishments make you accomplished, and that your social position gives you the right to treat other human beings as if they exist solely for your convenience." Victoria started to interrupt, but Grace continued speaking with the kind of quiet authority that made even the most arrogant people instinctively fall silent. "What you don't seem to understand is that true power doesn't announce itself with expensive clothing or loud demands. True power doesn't need to justify itself to anyone because it speaks through actions rather than accusations." The cabin had become so quiet that the only sounds were the gentle hum of the aircraft's environmental systems and the distant murmur of passengers still boarding in economy class. Even the flight attendants who had been moving through their pre-flight routines had stopped to listen, sensing that they were witnessing something that would become part of airline folklore. "You want to know who belongs in first class?" Grace continued, her voice still soft but somehow filling the entire space. "Anyone who treats other human beings with basic dignity belongs here. Anyone who understands that respect is earned through character rather than purchased with credit cards belongs here. And anyone who recognizes that we're all just people trying to get from one place to another safely and comfortably belongs here." She paused, letting her words settle over the cabin like dust after an explosion. "What doesn't belong here? Mrs. Blackwood is the kind of behavior that reduces human beings to their economic value or judges their worth based on the color of their skin or the price of their clothing." Victoria's face had gone through another color transformation, this time settling on a shade of pale that suggested all the blood had rushed away from her head toward more essential organs. She seemed to be struggling to find words that could restore her sense of dominance in a conversation that had somehow slipped completely out of her control. "I know important people," Victoria said, finally her voice lacking its earlier conviction but still carrying the desperate edge of someone trying to play their last card. "I know senators and governors and CEOs who would be very interested to hear about how this airline treats its paying customers. One phone call from me could cost this company millions in lost business." Grace smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun, but it wasn't the kind of warm expression that reaches the eyes. It was the kind of smile that lawyers wore when their opponents had just made a critical error in judgment. "Please," she said, gesturing toward Victoria's phone, "make your calls." The heavy click of the cockpit door opening seemed to echo through the first-class cabin with the finality of a judge's gavel, announcing the arrival of the one person whose authority was unquestionable at 30,000 feet. Captain James Rodriguez stepped into the cabin with the measured stride of someone who had been dealing with in-flight emergencies and difficult passengers for more than 2 decades, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the confrontation that had been escalating for the past 10 minutes. At 52, Captain Rodriguez carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from successfully landing aircraft in hurricanes, navigating through mechanical failures that would have terrified lesser pilots, and maintaining the safety of thousands of passengers who had trusted him with their lives. His uniform was pressed to military precision, his shoulders straight but not rigid, and his expression carried the neutral professionalism that experienced pilots learned to maintain regardless of whatever chaos was unfolding around them. Maya Peterson felt a wave of relief wash over her as she saw the captain approaching, knowing that whatever happened next would be handled with the kind of decisive authority that her customer service training hadn't prepared her to exercise. She had been watching the confrontation escalate beyond her ability to control, and she recognized that Grace Washington's calm responses seemed to be infuriating Victoria Blackwood rather than de-escalating the situation. "Good afternoon, Captain Rodriguez," said his voice carrying the kind of measured authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone in the cabin. I'm Captain Rodriguez, and I understand there's some concern about seating arrangements. Perhaps someone could explain the situation so we can resolve this quickly and get everyone safely to London." Victoria Blackwood immediately pivoted toward the captain with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that drowning people showed when spotting a life preserver, clearly assuming that a uniformed authority figure would naturally side with someone of her obvious social standing. "Captain, thank goodness you're here," she began, her voice taking on the kind of sweetly reasonable tone that people used when they were trying to convince someone that their completely unreasonable demands were actually quite logical. This woman, Victoria continued gesturing toward Grace with the kind of dismissive wave usually reserved for shooing away annoying insects, is clearly not supposed to be in first class. I don't know how she managed to get past security or what kind of fraudulent documentation she's using, but she absolutely does not belong here. I've been flying first class for years, and I know what these passengers look like. Captain Rodriguez's expression didn't change as he listened to Victoria's explanation, though anyone who had served with him for any length of time would have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was processing information that he found deeply troubling. He had heard variations of this complaint before, usually from passengers who seemed to believe that the price of their ticket entitled them to approve the demographic composition of their fellow travelers. "Ma'am, Captain Rodriguez," replied, his tone remaining professionally neutral, despite the fact that Victoria's comments had immediately revealed the nature of her complaint. Airline tickets are sold to qualified passengers, regardless of their appearance. If this passenger has a valid boarding pass and proper identification, then she has every right to be here. Victoria's face flushed again with the kind of frustrated anger that people exhibited when their assumptions about automatic support from authority figures proved to be incorrect. "But Captain, surely you can see that this is inappropriate. I'm a platinum member. I've probably spent more money with this airline than most people make in a year, and I deserve better than this." "What exactly do you deserve, Mrs. Blackwood?" The question came not from Captain Rodriguez but from Grace Washington, who had remained seated throughout the exchange but whose quiet voice seemed to cut through Victoria's increasingly frantic explanations like a scalpel through tissue paper. Captain Rodriguez turned toward seat 1A to address the passenger who had been the target of Victoria's complaints, preparing to apologize for the disruption and reassure her that the airline's policy was to treat all passengers with equal respect. But as his eyes met those of the woman in the simple navy cardigan, his expression underwent a transformation that was immediately visible to everyone watching. The professional mask of neutral authority slipped away from Captain Rodriguez's face, replaced by an expression of recognition that seemed to drain the color from his cheeks and cause his hand to tremble slightly as it reached instinctively toward his cap. His mouth opened as if he were about to speak, but no sound emerged for several long seconds as he stared at Grace Washington with the kind of stunned amazement that people displayed when they encountered someone they had thought they would never see again. "Mrs. Washington." Captain Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the aircraft's systems, carrying a tone of respect and recognition that made it clear this was no ordinary passenger. The formal title seemed to hang in the air like an incantation, transforming the atmosphere of the cabin from tension to something approaching reverence. Grace Washington looked up at Captain Rodriguez with a slight smile that suggested she had been expecting this moment of recognition, though she had been curious to see how long it would take him to place her face in the context of their shared history. "Hello, James," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone greeting an old colleague. "It's good to see you again." Victoria Blackwood looked between the captain and Grace with growing confusion, her earlier confidence beginning to waver as she processed the obvious familiarity between them. This wasn't the kind of interaction she had expected when she demanded that the captain resolve her seating complaint, and the respectful tone that this uniformed authority figure was using toward the woman she had been trying to have removed was causing her to question whether she had somehow misunderstood the situation. "I apologize for the disturbance," Captain Rodriguez said, though he was addressing Grace rather than Victoria, his voice carrying the kind of formal respect that junior officers used when speaking to superior officers. "I wasn't aware that you were traveling with us today." "I prefer to fly under the radar," Grace replied, using a phrase that carried multiple meanings in the context of aviation. "It's the only way to see how things really work when people think no one important is watching." The implication of her words seemed to settle over the cabin like a slowly dawning realization, causing the other passengers to look at Grace Washington with new interest, and making Victoria Blackwood's face cycle through several expressions, as she began to suspect that she had made a serious miscalculation about the relative importance of the people involved in this confrontation. Captain Rodriguez straightened to attention with the kind of instinctive military precision that suggested this was an automatic response to being in the presence of someone whose authority he recognized and respected. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying the formal tone of someone making an official report. "Is there anything you need me to address regarding this situation?" The question was clearly directed at Grace, rather than Victoria, representing a complete reversal of the power dynamic that Victoria had assumed would favor her when she demanded the captain's intervention. The silence that followed Captain Rodriguez's recognition of Grace Washington was the kind of profound quiet that settles over a space when everyone present realizes they are witnessing something historically significant, the kind of moment that would be discussed in break rooms and training seminars for years to come. Victoria Blackwood stood frozen in the aisle, her expensive handbag clutched against her chest like a shield as the carefully constructed narrative of her superiority began to crumble around her with the slow-motion inevitability of a controlled demolition. Captain Rodriguez seemed to be struggling with the cognitive dissonance of seeing someone he had only encountered in the rarefied atmosphere of corporate boardrooms and official ceremonies, sitting quietly in seat 1A wearing a simple cardigan and reading a paperback book. His training had taught him to maintain professional composure under any circumstances, but 25 years of gratitude and respect were making it difficult for him to treat this encounter as a routine passenger interaction. "Mrs. Washington," he began again, his voice carrying the kind of careful formality that people used when they weren't sure whether they were supposed to salute or shake hands. "I had no idea you were planning to travel with us today. If we had known, we would have ensured that your experience was completely comfortable and private." Grace Washington's smile carried a hint of amusement that suggested she found Captain Rodriguez's discomfort endearing rather than problematic. "James, if I had wanted a private and comfortable experience, I would have taken my own aircraft," she replied, her voice carrying just enough authority to remind him that such options were readily available to her. "I'm here because I want to see how my airline treats passengers when the CEO isn't watching." The phrase "my airline" seemed to echo through the first-class cabin like a bomb dropping in slow motion, causing every passenger within earshot to suddenly reevaluate everything they thought they understood about the situation they had been witnessing. Marcus Chen's laptop slid off his tray table as his hands went slack with surprise. Rebecca Martinez's architectural plans scattered as she turned to stare at Grace with new understanding, and the young parents with their baby daughter suddenly found themselves wondering if they had just witnessed one of the most expensive mistakes in customer service history. Victoria Blackwood's face underwent a series of transformations that would have been comical if the implications weren't so devastating to her social standing and financial future. The color drained from her cheeks, as if someone had opened a valve, then rushed back in a flood of crimson that clashed horribly with her carefully applied makeup. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, like a fish gasping for air after being pulled from its natural environment. "Your airline," Victoria finally managed to whisper the words seeming to catch in her throat like thorns. "What do you mean, your airline?" Captain Rodriguez found himself in the unique position of watching someone who had spent the last 15 minutes demanding special treatment based on her perceived importance slowly realized that she had been insulting someone whose actual importance dwarfed her inherited wealth like a mountain dwarfs a pebble. His professional training was telling him to find a diplomatic way to diffuse the situation, but his personal gratitude to Grace Washington was making it difficult to feel sympathetic towards someone who had just demonstrated the kind of behavior that violated every principle his employer stood for. Mrs. Blackwood, Captain Rodriguez, said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering news that was going to fundamentally change the recipient's understanding of reality. I'd like you to meet Grace Washington, the founder and majority owner of Horizon Airways. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, visible and tangible and impossible to ignore. Victoria Blackwood swayed slightly on her expensive heels as the full implications of what she had just learned began to penetrate her consciousness with the slow, inexorable force of water seeping through a cracked dam. She had spent the last 15 minutes trying to have the owner of the airline removed from her own airplane for the crime of not looking like Victoria thought a first-class passenger should look. "That's impossible," Victoria said, but her voice lacked any conviction, carrying the desperate tone of someone trying to deny evidence that was standing right in front of her. "She's wearing a cardigan from Target. She looks like someone's grandmother." Grace Washington finally stood up from her seat, rising with the kind of measured dignity that comes from a lifetime of commanding respect through competence rather than demanding it through wealth. At 70, she might have looked like someone's grandmother, but there was something in her bearing that suddenly made it clear why flight crews had been trained to recognize her and why Captain Rodriguez had instinctively straightened to attention in her presence. "Mrs. Blackwood Grace," said her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of passengers. "I am indeed someone's grandmother. I'm also someone who built this airline from 3 failing aircraft and a mountain of debt into one of the most respected carriers in the world. And I did it by recognizing that how someone looks has absolutely nothing to do with their worth as a human being." Victoria seemed to shrink in on herself as the magnitude of her mistake became clear, her expensive clothing and designer accessories suddenly looking like costume jewelry on someone playing dress-up. She had built her entire post-widowhood identity on the assumption that money could buy respect, and that social position could substitute for actual accomplishment, and she was now discovering that she had just humiliated herself in front of someone whose actual achievements made her inherited wealth look insignificant. "I didn't know," Victoria whispered the words, carrying all the weight of someone whose carefully constructed world view was collapsing around them. "How was I supposed to know?" "You weren't supposed to know," Grace replied, her voice still calm, but carrying an undertone that suggested she was making a point about something more significant than airline seating arrangements. "That's exactly the point, Mrs. Blackwood. You weren't supposed to need to know who I was in order to treat me with basic human dignity. You should have treated me with respect because I'm a person, not because I'm a person who happens to own the aircraft you're sitting in." Captain Rodriguez watched this exchange with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching masters at work in their chosen fields, recognizing that he was witnessing Grace Washington do what she had always done best, turning a moment of conflict into a teachable moment about human dignity and corporate values. He had seen her do this in boardrooms and training seminars, but watching her apply these principles while being personally attacked added a new dimension to his understanding of the kind of leader she had always been. Maya Peterson stood nearby, still holding her clipboard, but no longer pretending to perform routine pre-flight duties. Recognizing that she was witnessing something that would become part of airline legend and probably be referenced in future training programs about handling difficult passengers and maintaining company values under pressure. The other passengers had given up any pretense of minding their own business and were now openly staring at the unfolding drama with the kind of riveted attention usually reserved for natural disasters or award show acceptance speeches that go catastrophically wrong. The moment that followed Grace Washington's revelation about her identity was like the eye of a hurricane, deceptively calm, but charged with the potential for even greater devastation. Victoria Blackwood stood in the aisle clutching her designer handbag, as if it were a life preserver, her carefully constructed sense of superiority crumbling around her like a sandcastle facing an incoming tide. "I don't believe you," Victoria said, but her voice carried the hollow desperation of someone trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. If you really owned this airline, you would be flying on your private jet, not sitting in coach-wearing clearance rack clothing. Grace Washington reached into the small leather purse beside her seat. Her movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the tension crackling through the cabin like electricity before a storm. She withdrew a simple black card that looked innocuous to untrained eyes, but caused Captain Rodriguez to straighten his shoulders and Maya Peterson to audibly gasp in recognition. The card was matte black, with a subtle holographic seal embedded in the center, bearing only the Horizon Airways crest and a series of numbers that meant nothing to most people, but everything to those who understood the airline's hierarchy of authority. There were fewer than a dozen of these cards in existence worldwide, and seeing one was like encountering a unicorn in the wild for most airline employees. This is a chairman's authority card. Captain Rodriguez explained, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing religious artifacts or national treasures. It provides unlimited access to any Horizon Airways aircraft facility or service worldwide. They're only issued to board members and senior executives. Victoria stared at the card as if it might transform into something more familiar and less threatening to her worldview. But the holographic security features and Captain Rodriguez's obvious recognition of its significance made it impossible to dismiss as an elaborate fraud. The implications were settling over her like a heavy blanket, making it difficult to breathe and even harder to think clearly. Even if that's real, Victoria said, grasping for any remaining thread of justification for her behavior, it doesn't excuse the fact that you deceived everyone by dressing like a welfare recipient. If you had looked like someone important, none of this would have happened. The words seemed to hang in the air like a toxic cloud, revealing the depth of Victoria's misunderstanding about how respect and dignity actually worked. Grace Washington smiled sadly, the expression carrying 40 years of experience dealing with people who confused appearance with substance and wealth with worth. Mrs. Blackwood Grace said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining a simple concept to a student who was struggling to understand what you've just said, reveals everything that's wrong with your approach to human relationships. You believe that respect should be based on appearance, that dignity should be rationed according to perceived social status, and that common courtesy should be conditional on meeting your personal standards of worthiness. Maya Peterson found herself mentally taking notes as she watched Grace Washington transform what could have been a simple power play into a masterclass in leadership and human decency. This was exactly the kind of situation that airline training programs tried to prepare flight crews for, but watching it handled by someone with Grace's level of experience and authority was like watching a virtuoso pianist perform a piece that most people could barely read. "I've been flying incognito for 40 years. Grace continued, settling back into her seat, with the calm confidence of someone who had just played their opening move in a chess game they were certain to win. "I've seen how my employees treat passengers when they think no one important is watching, and I've learned more about our actual service quality from these flights than from 1,000 corporate reports." Captain Rodriguez nodded in understanding, remembering training sessions where senior executives had emphasized the importance of treating every passenger with equal respect, regardless of their apparent social status or economic circumstances. Now he understood that those policies had been developed by someone who regularly experienced airline service from the passenger perspective and who had personal experience with discrimination and social prejudice. "What I've discovered over the years," Grace said, looking directly at Victoria with the kind of steady gaze that made it impossible to look away, "is that the passengers who demand special treatment based on their wealth are usually the ones who treat our staff with the least respect, while the passengers who dress simply and speak quietly are often the ones who understand that traveling together requires mutual consideration and basic human decency." Victoria's face had gone through several color changes during this explanation, settling on a pale shade that suggested her blood pressure was experiencing significant fluctuations. She seemed to be struggling to process the idea that her behavior was being evaluated by someone whose opinion actually mattered in ways that could affect her beyond this single flight. Furthermore, Grace continued her voice, taking on the tone of someone who was accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. I should point out that your assumption about my clothing budget reveals another fundamental misunderstanding about wealth and priorities. This cardigan belonged to my late husband, and I wear it on flights because it reminds me of the values that built this airline: humility, hard work, and treating every person with the dignity they deserve as a human being. The revelation that Grace's simple appearance was a deliberate choice rather than a financial limitation seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow, causing her to stumble slightly and reach for the nearest seat back for support. She had built her entire argument on the assumption that Grace's modest clothing indicated modest means, and discovering that it actually represented something much more sophisticated and intentional was forcing her to reconsider everything she thought she understood about the situation. The weight of Grace Washington's revelation settled over the first-class cabin, like fog rolling in from the ocean, transforming familiar surroundings into something foreign and uncertain. Victoria Blackwood found herself standing in the aisle of an aircraft owned by the woman she had spent the last 20 minutes trying to have ejected for not meeting her aesthetic standards, and the irony was so profound that it seemed to bend reality around itself. 40 years ago, Grace began her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone recounting history that she had lived rather than learned from textbooks. This airline consisted of 3 aging Boeing 727s, a hangar full of unpaid mechanics, and enough debt to sink a small country. The previous owners had walked away. The creditors were circling like vultures, and everyone in the aviation industry considered it a cautionary tale about the dangers of overexpansion and poor management. Captain Rodriguez found himself listening with the rapt attention of someone hearing the creation myth of his professional world, understanding for the first time how the company that had shaped his entire career had emerged from the ashes of corporate failure through the vision and determination of the quietly dignified woman sitting in seat 1A. I was 30 years old, Grace continued, her eyes taking on a distant quality as she traveled back through decades of memory, a recent widow with a 2-year-old daughter and a life insurance settlement that everyone told me I should invest conservatively in government bonds and blue-chip stocks. Instead, I liquidated everything I owned, borrowed against my future earnings, and purchased the assets of a failing airline, because I believed that commercial aviation could be something better than an industry that treated passengers like cargo and employees like disposable resources. Victoria listened to this recitation with growing horror, recognizing that she was learning about the personal history of someone whose financial power made her own inherited wealth look like pocket change. The story Grace was telling wasn't just corporate history. It was the biography of someone who had built an empire through personal sacrifice and strategic vision rather than inheriting it through matrimonial good fortune. The first 5 years nearly broke me. Grace admitted, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had survived challenges that would have destroyed less determined individuals. I worked 18-hour days, slept in airport lounges more often than in my own bed, and made decisions that affected thousands of jobs while trying to raise a daughter who barely knew what her mother looked like. Maya Peterson found herself captivated by this glimpse into the personal cost of building something significant, understanding for the first time that the company values she had been trained to uphold weren't abstract corporate policies, but the personal convictions of someone who had sacrificed everything to create something better than what had existed before. But what sustained me through those difficult years, Grace said, her voice strengthening as she reached the part of the story that explained why she was sitting in this cabin today, was the memory of my husband Samuel and the values he had taught me about treating every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances. He had been a teacher before his death, and he used to tell me that you could judge the character of a society by observing how its most privileged members treated its most vulnerable citizens. The mention of her late husband brought a softness to Grace's expression that transformed her from a corporate titan into someone who had loved deeply and lost profoundly, adding a human dimension to the business narrative that made her accomplishments even more remarkable in context. Samuel died on this exact date 40 years ago. Grace continued her voice carrying the quiet grief that time diminishes, but never completely erases. We were supposed to take this flight to London for our delayed honeymoon, the trip we had postponed while building our life together and starting our family. Every year on the anniversary of his death, I take this route as a way of honoring his memory and completing the journey we never got to take together. Captain Rodriguez felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized that this wasn't just a routine flight for Grace Washington, but an annual pilgrimage that carried decades of personal significance. The fact that Victoria Blackwood had chosen this particular flight to demonstrate her prejudices seemed like cosmic irony of the highest order. "I fly commercial rather than taking my private aircraft," Grace explained, "because I want to see how our passengers actually experience our service when they don't know they're being observed by the owner. I want to understand what it feels like to be treated with courtesy or disrespect, to experience the small kindnesses and casual cruelties that shape how people remember their travels." Victoria's face had gone through so many color changes that she looked like a chameleon having an identity crisis, and her grip on her designer handbag had tightened to the point where her knuckles were showing white through her artificially tanned skin. She seemed to be struggling to process the magnitude of the mistake she had made, both in terms of misreading the situation and in revealing her character so completely to someone whose opinion could have far-reaching consequences. "What I've learned from these annual flights," Grace continued, looking directly at Victoria with the kind of steady gaze that made it impossible to hide behind pretense or self-deception, "is that true character reveals itself most clearly in moments of stress or inconvenience. Some passengers treat flight delays as opportunities to practice patience and show consideration for crew members who are working to resolve problems beyond their control. Others use minor inconveniences as excuses to demonstrate their sense of superiority over people they perceive as their social inferiors." The indictment was delivered without raised voices or accusatory gestures, but its impact was devastating precisely because of its quiet authority and obvious truth. Victoria had revealed her character completely during the past 20 minutes, and everyone in the cabin had witnessed the kind of person she became when she thought she had power over someone she considered beneath her notice. Mrs. Blackwood Grace said, her voice taking on the formal tone of someone making an official pronouncement. "You asked earlier, what gave me the right to determine who belongs where? The answer is simple. I own this aircraft, I employ every person working on this flight, and I have built this company on the principle that every passenger deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status." The silence that followed this statement was so complete that the only sounds in the cabin were the gentle hum of the environmental systems and the distant murmur of passengers still boarding in the economy section, blissfully unaware that they were about to take off on what would become one of the most talked-about flights in aviation history. Victoria Blackwood stood in the aisle like a statue commemorating the dangers of prejudice and entitlement, her expensive clothing and accessories now looking like costume pieces in a morality play about the consequences of confusing wealth with worth and appearance with character. "Now," Grace said, settling back into her seat with the calm satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a masterclass in corporate leadership and human dignity, "I believe we have a schedule to keep, and I'm quite looking forward to completing this journey that my husband and I planned to take together 40 years ago." The transformation in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable, like the moment when storm clouds part to reveal brilliant sunshine that illuminates everything in startling clarity. Victoria Blackwood found herself standing at the epicenter of a social earthquake that had fundamentally altered the geography of power around her, leaving her stranded on an island of her own making while everyone else found themselves on solid ground. Maya Peterson experienced a profound shift in her understanding of the situation she had been trying to manage, realizing that she had been watching someone attack not just a fellow passenger, but the person whose vision and values had shaped every aspect of her professional training. The customer service protocols she had been following suddenly made perfect sense in context, revealing themselves as practical applications of principles that Grace Washington had developed through decades of building an airline that prioritized human dignity over profit margins. Mrs. Washington. Maya said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect and recognition. I want to apologize for any discomfort this situation has caused you. If there's anything I can do to ensure the rest of your flight is peaceful and pleasant, please let me know. Grace smiled warmly at the young flight attendant, her expression carrying the kind of approval that good teachers gave to students who had grasped an important lesson. Maya, you've handled this situation with exactly the kind of professionalism and grace that makes me proud to have my name associated with this airline. You followed our protocols perfectly, treating both passengers with respect while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The acknowledgement seemed to transform Maya Peterson from a nervous young employee into someone who understood that she was part of something larger and more meaningful than a simple service industry job. She had been representing not just company policies, but the personal values of someone who had built an empire on the foundation of treating every human being with dignity. Marcus Chen, the tech entrepreneur in seat 2B, had been watching the entire confrontation with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made in real time. As someone who had built his own company from nothing, he recognized the quiet authority and strategic thinking that Grace Washington had displayed throughout the confrontation, understanding that he had just observed a masterclass in leadership under pressure. Mrs. Washington, Marcus said, his voice carrying the respectful tone of one entrepreneur acknowledging another. I've been following your company's innovations in sustainable aviation and passenger experience. It's an honor to meet you, and I have to say that watching you handle this situation has been more educational than most business school case studies I've seen. Grace Washington turned toward Marcus with the kind of genuine interest that successful people showed when they encountered others who understood the challenges and responsibilities of building something significant. Mr. Chen, isn't it I've read about your work in educational technology? Your software is helping children around the world access quality education regardless of their geographic or economic circumstances. That's exactly the kind of innovation that gives me hope for the future. The exchange between Grace Washington and Marcus Chen served to further highlight Victoria Blackwood's isolation in the cabin, demonstrating the kind of respectful interaction between accomplished individuals that contrasted sharply with her earlier behavior. Victoria seemed to shrink further into herself as she observed how easily Grace commanded respect from people who recognized competence and achievement when they saw it. Rebecca Martinez, the architect in seat 3. A looked up from her plans with new understanding of the dynamics she had been witnessing, recognizing that she had just observed someone whose buildings were metaphorical rather than physical, but no less impressive for their intangible nature. Grace Washington had constructed an airline that existed as both a business enterprise and a social institution, creating something that served human needs while generating the resources necessary to sustain and expand its mission. Captain Rodriguez found himself in the unique position of watching his employer handle a crisis with the same calm competence that had made Horizon Airways one of the most respected carriers in the industry. He had attended countless training sessions about maintaining company values under pressure, but seeing Grace Washington personally demonstrate these principles while being attacked added new depth to his understanding of what the airline actually represented. Captain Rodriguez Grace said, her voice taking on the tone of someone giving instructions that were actually suggestions from someone whose authority made them indistinguishable from commands. I believe Mrs. Blackwood may need some time to process what she's learned today. Perhaps she would be more comfortable completing her journey on a different aircraft, one where she might feel less conflicted about the ownership structure. The suggestion was delivered with the kind of gentle courtesy that made it sound like customer service rather than corporate discipline, but everyone in the cabin understood that they had just witnessed someone being politely ejected from an aircraft by its owner for behavior that violated the basic principles of human decency. Victoria Blackwood seemed to come back to consciousness like someone waking from a nightmare, only to discover that the nightmare was actually her real life, and that she was about to face consequences that would extend far beyond the duration of this flight. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a note of panic that suggested she was beginning to understand the implications of what had just transpired. "You can't just kick me off the plane. I have rights. I have a ticket." Grace Washington looked at Victoria with the kind of patient expression that experienced teachers used when explaining consequences to students who had made poor choices. "Mrs. Blackwood, you absolutely have rights as a passenger, and under normal circumstances those rights would be vigorously protected by this airline. However, you also have responsibilities as a passenger, including treating fellow travelers and crew members with basic respect and courtesy." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, understanding that his role in this situation was to provide the official authority that would formalize Grace Washington's decision while maintaining the professional protocols that governed airline operations. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone making an official announcement based on your behavior toward fellow passengers and your disruption of normal flight operations. "I'm exercising my authority as captain to deny you carriage on this flight for the safety and comfort of other passengers and crew members." The pronouncement seemed to echo through the cabin with the finality of a judge passing sentence, marking the moment when Victoria Blackwood's sense of entitlement collided with the immutable reality of consequences that money could not buy. Social connections could not influence, and inherited status could not prevent. Grace Washington reached into her purse with the deliberate care of someone who understood that what happened next would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Victoria Blackwood's life. Pulling out a slim satellite phone that looked deceptively simple but represented access to networks of power that most people could only imagine. The device was the kind of communication tool that heads of state carried for emergencies, designed to work anywhere in the world and connect directly to priority networks that bypassed normal commercial channels. Mrs. Blackwood Grace set her finger hovering over the speed dial that would connect her to lawyers, accountants, and corporate executives who could reshape Victoria's financial landscape with a few strategic phone calls. "Before I make this call, I want to ensure you understand the full scope of what you've accomplished here today. You see, when you inherit wealth, rather than building it, you sometimes lose sight of how interconnected the financial world really is." Victoria's face had progressed beyond the simple color changes that had marked her earlier emotional states, settling into a sickly pallor that suggested her body was beginning to understand what her mind had not yet fully processed. She stared at the satellite phone as if it were a weapon pointed directly at her future financial security, which in many ways it was. 40 years ago, when I built this airline from bankruptcy," Grace continued, her voice taking on the instructional tone of someone delivering a lecture that would have profound practical implications for her audience, "I learned that success in business requires diversification and strategic partnerships. You can't just focus on one industry or rely on a single source of revenue, because economic conditions change and markets shift in ways that can destroy unprepared businesses overnight." Captain Rodriguez watched this explanation with the kind of fascinated attention that people showed when watching a chess grandmaster explain the strategy behind a move that seemed simple but carried implications that wouldn't become clear until several turns later. He was beginning to understand that Grace Washington's response to Victoria's behavior was going to involve more than simply removing her from this particular flight. Over the decades, Grace explained, scrolling through her phone's contact list with practiced efficiency. Horizon Airways has grown into Robinson Holdings, a diversified investment firm with interests in real estate technology, insurance, and financial services. We've found that airlines generate useful data about travel patterns, consumer behavior, and economic trends that can be extremely valuable when making investment decisions in other sectors. Maya Peterson found herself taking mental notes about corporate strategy and business development, understanding that she was receiving the kind of insider education about how large-scale business operations worked that most people paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to learn in graduate school programs. One of our subsidiary companies. Grace continued, her finger stopping at a particular contact that made Victoria's eyes widen with recognition. Is Robinson Insurance Group, which specializes in providing coverage for high-net-worth individuals and families who need protection for complex asset portfolios. We've found that wealthy families often have financial structures that are more fragile than they appear, with interconnected obligations and dependencies that can create vulnerability if someone decides to conduct a thorough review of their arrangements. The implications of what Grace was saying began to penetrate Victoria's consciousness, like water seeping through a cracked foundation, carrying with it the understanding that her comfortable life was built on financial structures that she had never bothered to understand, but that were apparently well known to the woman she had been trying to humiliate for the past half hour. Mrs. Blackwood, Grace said, looking directly into Victoria's increasingly panicked eyes. Your late husband was indeed a brilliant innovator, but he was also someone who took significant financial risks and used complex leveraging strategies to fund his various ventures. When he died, he left you a substantial inheritance, but he also left you with obligations and dependencies that you've probably never examined closely. Victoria's hands began to tremble as the satellite phone connected to Robinson Holdings' executive offices, where Grace's legal and financial teams maintained comprehensive databases about their insurance clients, investment partners, and potential business relationships. The technology that had made Victoria's husband wealthy had also generated detailed digital records of his business practices, financial obligations, and strategic relationships. Richard, Grace said into the phone, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone who was accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. I need you to review the Blackwood estate portfolio immediately. I'm particularly interested in the insurance coverage for their Manhattan properties, the liability limits on their Hamptons residence, and the reinsurance agreements that we hold through our London syndicate. Victoria listened to this conversation with growing horror, understanding for the first time that her financial security was not the impregnable fortress she had believed it to be, but rather a complex structure that depended on the goodwill and business relationships of people like Grace Washington, people whose own networks of influence extended far beyond anything Victoria had ever imagined or attempted to understand. Furthermore, Grace continued into the phone. I want you to review the morality clauses in their coverage agreements, particularly the sections that address public behavior and reputational risk. We may need to invoke some of the discretionary review provisions that allow us to reassess coverage terms when client behavior suggests increased liability exposure. The mention of morality clauses seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow, causing her to reach for the nearest seat back for support, as she realized that her behavior on this flight was about to have consequences that extended far beyond social embarrassment or airline travel privileges. Her financial stability was apparently subject to terms and conditions that she had never read, but that could be triggered by exactly the kind of public display she had just performed. Yes, Grace said into the phone. We do have video documentation of the incident, and it's already becoming viral content on social media platforms. I'll forward the relevant materials to your office for legal review, and I want recommendations for appropriate actions on my desk before we land in London. Victoria Blackwood found herself standing in the aisle of an aircraft that was about to take off without her watching the owner of that aircraft systematically dismantle the financial structures that had supported her lifestyle for the past 2 years, all as a direct consequence of her decision to judge someone's worth based on their clothing rather than their character. The satellite phone call ended with the efficiency of someone who had just set powerful machinery in motion, leaving Victoria to contemplate the reality that she had just discovered how quickly inherited wealth could evaporate when it collided with the kind of real power that came from building something significant rather than simply inheriting the results of someone else's accomplishments. The heavy footsteps on the jet bridge announced the arrival of airport security with the kind of authoritative cadence that suggested this was no longer a customer service issue, but had evolved into a matter that required official intervention. Victoria Blackwood turned toward the approaching sound with the desperate hope of someone who believed that uniformed authority would naturally side with her obvious social superiority over someone whose appearance suggested she belonged in a different economic category entirely. Two Port Authority officers entered the first-class cabin with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had dealt with every conceivable variety of passenger disruption, from intoxicated celebrities to paranoid conspiracy theorists who believed the government was tracking them through airplane Wi-Fi. The lead officer, Sergeant Martinez, was a 20-year veteran who had developed the ability to assess complex situations quickly and determine the appropriate level of response based on evidence rather than assumptions. "Good afternoon," Sergeant Martinez said, his voice carrying the neutral authority of someone who was there to restore order rather than take sides in whatever conflict had necessitated his intervention. "I'm Sergeant Martinez with Port Authority Police. We received a report of a disruptive passenger refusing crew instructions. Can someone explain the situation?" Victoria immediately surged forward with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that suggested she viewed the arrival of law enforcement as vindication rather than escalation, clearly believing that official authority would recognize her obvious righteousness and remove the problematic passenger who had somehow infiltrated first class despite her obviously inappropriate appearance. "Officer, thank goodness you're here." Victoria began, her voice taking on the kind of sweetly reasonable tone that people used when they wanted to sound rational while making completely irrational demands. "This woman has been harassing me throughout this entire boarding process, and the flight crew refuses to remove her despite the fact that she clearly doesn't belong in first class." Sergeant Martinez looked between Victoria's expensive clothing and obvious agitation, and Grace Washington's calm composure and dignified bearing, immediately recognizing the kind of dynamic that experienced law enforcement officers learned to identify quickly. In his experience, the person making the loudest complaints was often the person who had created the problem in the first place. "Ma'am," Sergeant Martinez said, addressing Victoria with professional courtesy while maintaining the kind of neutral expression that revealed nothing about his personal opinions regarding the situation. "What specific actions has this passenger taken that you consider harassment?" The question seemed to catch Victoria off guard, as if the idea that she would need to provide evidence rather than simply making accusations had never occurred to her. Her mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to frame her complaints in terms that would sound legitimate to someone whose job required them to distinguish between actual problems and personal preferences. "She refused to move when I asked her to give up her seat," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the kind of indignation that suggested she couldn't believe she was being asked to justify her perfectly reasonable request. "I explained that I'm a premium passenger and that I expect a certain level of exclusivity in first class, but she just sat there acting like she belonged here." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward to provide the official airline perspective on the situation, understanding that Sergeant Martinez would need to hear from the flight crew in order to make an appropriate decision about how to proceed. "Officer, this passenger," he gestured toward Victoria, "has been disrupting normal boarding procedures by demanding that we remove another passenger who has a valid ticket and proper documentation. Furthermore," Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone making an official report, "she has made statements that suggest her complaints are based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate safety or security concerns. The passenger she wants removed is actually Mrs. Grace Washington, the owner and chairman emeritus of this airline." Sergeant Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly at this information. though his expression remained professionally neutral as he processed the implications of what he had just learned. In his experience, passengers who demanded special treatment based on their perceived importance were often the ones who understood least about how authority actually worked in the real world. "Mrs. Washington," Sergeant Martinez said, turning toward Grace with the kind of respectful attention that experienced officers showed when addressing someone whose authority they recognized. "Do you have any complaints about this passenger's behavior toward you?" Grace. Washington looked up from her seat with the calm dignity of someone who had spent decades handling difficult situations with grace and strategic thinking. Understanding that how she responded to this question would determine not only the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but also set an important precedent for how similar situations would be handled in the future. Officer Martinez Grace said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who was accustomed to being listened to when she spoke. "Mrs. Blackwood has certainly been vocal about her displeasure with my presence on this aircraft, but I'm more concerned about the disruption she's causing to our departure schedule and the discomfort she's creating for other passengers and crew members." The response was perfectly calculated to demonstrate Grace's reasonableness, while highlighting Victoria's behavior as the actual problem that needed to be addressed, and Sergeant Martinez recognized immediately that he was dealing with someone who understood how to frame issues in terms that law enforcement could act upon effectively. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sergeant Martinez said, turning back to Victoria with the kind of official tone that suggested the social niceties were over, and it was time for practical decisions about what happened next, based on the flight crew's assessment and the airline owner's statement. "You're being denied carriage on this flight. You'll need to collect your belongings and come with us to resolve this matter through proper channels." The pronouncement hit Victoria like a physical blow, causing her to stumble backward against the seat as the reality of her situation finally penetrated her consciousness with unavoidable clarity. She was being removed from an aircraft by law enforcement officers for the crime of revealing her true character to someone whose power and authority dwarfed her inherited wealth like an ocean dwarfs a puddle. "This is impossible," Victoria whispered, her voice carrying the hollow desperation of someone whose carefully constructed worldview was collapsing around them in real time. "I'm Victoria Blackwood. I don't get removed from airplanes, I get people fired." Grace Washington remained seated throughout this exchange, watching Victoria's ejection with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served through proper channels rather than personal vengeance. Understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice and entitlement was simply allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices without interference or protection from their wealth or social connections. Victoria Blackwood's perp walk through the first-class cabin felt like a funeral procession for her former life, each step taking her further away from the world of privilege and presumption that had defined her existence for the past 2 years, and closer to a reality where her behavior had consequences that money couldn't erase. The other passengers watched in stunned silence as she gathered her designer luggage with trembling hands, her expensive accessories now looking like costume jewelry on someone whose performance had been exposed as elaborate fraud. The walk down the aisle toward the aircraft door was perhaps the longest journey of Victoria's life, made more excruciating by the fact that she had to pass through the economy section where passengers had their phones out, recording her humiliation for posterity and social media distribution. Someone in row 12 began slow clapping, and within seconds the entire cabin erupted in applause that followed her all the way to the jet bridge like a soundtrack of social justice. "Bye, Karen," someone shouted from the back of the plane, and Victoria's face flushed with the kind of burning shame that comes from realizing that you've become a public symbol of everything that's wrong with entitled behavior and social prejudice. The aircraft door closing behind her sounded like the final note of a symphony dedicated to the consequences of confusing wealth with worth and appearance with character. Standing in the jet bridge with 2 Port Authority officers, Victoria felt the full weight of her isolation settling over her like a heavy blanket. The comfortable bubble of privilege that had insulated her from consequences for the past 2 years had finally burst, leaving her exposed to the reality that she had just humiliated herself in front of someone whose power extended far beyond anything she had ever imagined or attempted to understand. Her first indication that this incident would have consequences beyond missing a single flight came when she tried to book alternative transportation to London using her Platinum American Express card. The agent at the British Airways counter ran the card once, frowned at his screen, then ran it again with the kind of professional concern that suggested he was seeing something unusual in his computer system. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwood," the agent said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that customer service representatives used when delivering bad news to obviously wealthy customers, "but your card appears to have been declined. Would you like to try a different payment method?" Victoria's hands shook as she handed over her backup cards, one by one watching each of them fail with the same error message that suggested her access to the financial resources that defined her identity had somehow been severed while she was being removed from Grace Washington's aircraft. The implications were settling over her like ice water, carrying with them the understanding that the satellite phone call she had witnessed was already producing results. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Richard Vance, the family attorney who had been managing her late husband's estate and who usually called only to inform her about dividend payments or investment returns that allowed her to maintain her expensive lifestyle without actually working or contributing anything meaningful to society. Victoria Richards' voice carried a note of panic that she had never heard before, suggesting that he was calling with news that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her financial situation. "Where are you right now? And what exactly did you do on that airplane?" The question confused Victoria, who hadn't yet made the connection between her behavior toward Grace Washington and the sudden failure of her credit card, still operating under the assumption that inherited wealth was somehow immune to the consequences of personal conduct and social behavior. "I'm at JFK trying to book a new flight to London." "Victoria," replied her voice, carrying the petulant tone of someone who was being inconvenienced rather than someone who was facing the systematic dismantling of her financial security. "Some crazy woman got me kicked off my original flight, and now my credit cards aren't working properly. I need you to call the banks and fix whatever technical glitch is causing this problem." Richard's laugh was harsh and bitter, carrying the kind of desperation that lawyers exhibited when they realized their clients had made decisions that were going to destroy both of their lives. "Victoria, this isn't a technical glitch. I just received calls from 3 different financial institutions informing me that Robinson Holdings has initiated a comprehensive audit of all Blackwood estate assets and insurance policies." The name Robinson Holdings hit Victoria like a physical blow, connecting the satellite phone call she had witnessed to the financial catastrophe that was apparently unfolding in real time. She had been so focused on Grace Washington's simple appearance and quiet demeanor that she had failed to understand that she was attacking someone whose corporate empire could eliminate her lifestyle with a few strategic phone calls. "According to the notifications I've received," Richard continued, his voice taking on the clinical tone that lawyers used when discussing legal disasters that they couldn't prevent, "Robinson Holdings is invoking morality and reputational risk clauses in your insurance policies, citing public behavior that creates liability exposure for their coverage agreements." Victoria felt the terminal floor seem to tilt beneath her feet as she realized that her confrontation with Grace Washington had triggered a cascade of financial consequences that were already rippling through the complex structures that supported her inherited wealth. The comfortable assumption that her money was safely protected from the consequences of her behavior was proving to be as illusory as her belief that social status could substitute for human decency. Furthermore, Richard said, his voice now carrying the tone of someone delivering news that he knew would be devastating. "I've been informed that Robinson Holdings controls significant portions of the reinsurance that protects your major assets, including the Manhattan apartment and the Hamptons estate. They're calling in loans and reviewing coverage terms, and I don't think we have the liquid capital to meet their demands. The satellite phone in Grace Washington's purse had been a weapon more powerful than any Victoria could have imagined, connected to financial networks that could reshape her entire existence without her permission or participation. She was discovering that real power wasn't about making demands or throwing tantrums, but about controlling the underlying structures that made other people's lifestyles possible. Richard Victoria whispered into her phone, her voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who was still trying to deny the magnitude of her situation. "Can't you do something? Call someone. Make this go away." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like hours before Richard finally responded with the kind of professional detachment that lawyers used when they were about to abandon clients whose problems had become unsolvable. "Victoria, I'm resigning as your counsel effective immediately. I've built my career on maintaining relationships with people like Grace Washington, and I'm not going to destroy my professional reputation by defending behavior that was captured on video and has already gone viral on social media platforms." The line went dead, leaving Victoria standing alone in the departure terminal, surrounded by travelers who were going places she could no longer afford to visit, holding a phone that connected her to a world that no longer wanted to hear from her. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, the first-class cabin of Flight 847 had settled into the kind of peaceful quiet that made transcontinental travel feel like meditation rather than transportation. Grace Washington had returned to her paperback book, though she found herself reading the same paragraph repeatedly as her mind wandered through 4 decades of memories triggered by the confrontation with Victoria Blackwood and the annual significance of this particular journey. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit during a routine break, leaving his first officer in command while he checked on the passengers and crew members who had witnessed what was already being discussed in aviation circles as one of the most dramatic passenger removals in recent memory. He approached Grace's seat with the kind of respectful deference that he had shown toward her for 25 years, understanding that she valued genuine conversation over empty formalities. "Mrs. Washington," Captain Rodriguez said, settling into the empty seat beside her with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had earned the right to casual interaction through years of shared professional respect. "I have to ask how you're feeling after what happened during boarding. That was an incredibly difficult situation, and I'm amazed by how calmly you handled it." Grace looked up from her book with the kind of thoughtful expression that suggested she had been processing the morning's events on multiple levels, understanding that Victoria Blackwood's behavior represented something larger and more troubling than simple individual prejudice. "James, I've been thinking about something my husband Samuel used to say about the difference between power and authority, and how people often confuse the two in ways that cause them to make terrible decisions." The mention of her late husband brought a softness to Grace's expression that Captain Rodriguez had rarely seen in their professional interactions, reminding him that this annual flight represented much more than business travel for the woman who had built Horizon Airways into one of the most respected carriers in the world. Samuel believed that power was something you had over other people, but authority was something you earned from other people. Grace continued, her voice taking on the reflective tone of someone sharing wisdom that had been gained through personal loss and professional challenge. "Mrs. Blackwood spent this morning trying to exercise power she didn't actually have over someone whose authority she completely failed to recognize." Captain Rodriguez nodded in understanding, recognizing that Grace was using the incident as an opportunity to explore broader questions about leadership respect and the responsibilities that came with genuine influence. It seemed like she was operating from a completely different understanding of how the world works, he observed, as if she believed that money automatically translated into moral authority. "The tragic part," Grace replied, looking out the window at the endless expanse of ocean below, "is that Mrs. Blackwood probably had opportunities to be genuinely important, to use her resources to make a positive difference in the world. But she chose instead to focus on maintaining social hierarchies that don't actually serve anyone's interests, including her own." Maya Peterson approached with a tea service, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested she understood the conversation she was interrupting carried more weight than typical passenger chat. "Mrs. Washington, I wanted to thank you personally for how you handled that situation. Watching you maintain your dignity while being attacked taught me more about professional leadership than all my training sessions combined." Grace accepted the tea with genuine gratitude, understanding that Maya's comments represented the real value of what had transpired during the boarding process. "Maya, one of the most important lessons I've learned in 40 years of business is that how you respond to people who treat you poorly says more about your character than how you respond to people who treat you well." The young flight attendant listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was storing these insights for future reference, understanding that she was receiving mentorship from someone whose experience and wisdom were rarely shared in such personal settings. "I have to admit there were moments when I wanted to tell Mrs. Blackwood exactly what I thought of her behavior, but watching you stay calm helped me remember my professional responsibilities. The temptation to respond to cruelty with cruelty is always present," Grace acknowledged. "But it's important to remember that other people's behavior is a reflection of their character, not yours. How you choose to respond is entirely within your control and completely independent of how others choose to act." Captain Rodriguez found himself thinking about his own career and the moments when he had faced similar choices between responding to difficult situations with anger or with measured professionalism. "Mrs. Washington, can I ask about the decision to invoke the financial consequences for Mrs. Blackwood's behavior?" That seemed like a level of response that went beyond simply removing her from the flight. Grace's expression became more serious as she considered the question, understanding that Captain Rodriguez was asking about the broader implications of using corporate power to address individual misconduct. "James, that's an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of why this annual flight is so important to me. When I travel incognito, I see how passengers treat crew members and fellow travelers when they don't think anyone important is watching." She paused to sip her tea, gathering her thoughts about issues that had shaped her approach to corporate leadership for decades. "What I've observed is that people like Mrs. Blackwood aren't usually confronted with meaningful consequences for their behavior, which means they continue to treat service workers and anyone they perceive as socially inferior with cruelty and disrespect. So the financial measures weren't about revenge," Captain Rodriguez said, beginning to understand the strategic thinking behind Grace's response. "They were about creating accountability for behavior that usually goes unchallenged." "Exactly," Grace confirmed. "Mrs. Blackwood revealed something important about her character this morning, and that information has legitimate relevance to business relationships and insurance assessments. Her behavior demonstrated poor judgment, impulse control problems, and a tendency toward publicly embarrassing conduct that creates reputational risks for anyone associated with her." Maya Peterson listened to this explanation with growing understanding of how corporate leadership and social responsibility could intersect in ways that created positive change, rather than simply protecting profit margins. "So you're using business tools to address social problems that government and social institutions haven't been able to solve effectively." Grace smiled at the young woman's insight, recognizing the kind of strategic thinking that suggested Maya Peterson had the potential for significant leadership roles if she continued developing her understanding of how different systems and institutions could work together to create positive change. "The goal isn't to destroy Mrs. Blackwood's life," Grace explained, "but to ensure that her wealth doesn't continue to insulate her from the consequences of treating other human beings poorly. Sometimes people need to experience genuine hardship before they develop empathy for others who struggle with challenges they didn't create for themselves." Heathrow Airport's VIP terminal buzzed with the kind of controlled energy that accompanied the arrival of someone whose presence would significantly impact the evening's most important social event in London. Grace Washington's flight had landed precisely on schedule, a testament to Captain Rodriguez's skill and the Horizon Airways' commitment to operational excellence that had been built into the company's culture from its earliest days. As the aircraft door opened, Grace was greeted not by the standard jet bridge, but by a private staircase leading to the tarmac, where a small convoy of vehicles waited with the kind of discreet efficiency that suggested someone had made arrangements that went far beyond normal airline passenger services. The contrast between her simple cardigan and the obvious importance being accorded to her arrival would have been striking to anyone who didn't understand that real influence often traveled in modest packaging. Marcus Webb Grace's chief executive officer for European operations stood at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, wearing the kind of perfectly tailored suit that suggested significant investment in personal presentation, though his expression carried the focused intensity of someone whose attention was entirely devoted to ensuring that every detail of Grace's arrival proceeded smoothly and according to plan. Mrs. Washington Marcus said, his voice carrying the respectful formality that Grace preferred from her senior executive's welcome to London. "I trust the flight was comfortable, despite the unusual circumstances that we've been monitoring through our security and communications networks." Grace descended the stairs with the measured pace of someone who understood that hurrying was a luxury she couldn't afford, given that her arrival was being recorded by discreet security cameras and observed by airport personnel who would undoubtedly share their observations with colleagues throughout the aviation industry. "Marcus, the flight was quite educational, though probably not in the way anyone expected when we departed New York this morning." The understatement was delivered with the kind of dry humor that had made Grace Washington legendary among her employees for her ability to find irony and learning opportunities in even the most challenging situations. Marcus had received detailed briefings about the Victoria Blackwood incident from multiple sources, including security footage, passenger recordings, and official reports from the flight crew, and he understood that the morning's events had implications that extended far beyond a single disruptive passenger. "The social media response has been extraordinary," Marcus reported as they walked toward the waiting vehicles, his tone carrying the kind of professional satisfaction that came from watching corporate values vindicated in such a public and dramatic fashion. The hashtag #GraceUnderPressure is trending internationally, and the video of Mrs. Blackwood's removal has been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. Grace listened to this information with the kind of measured attention that suggested she was processing the strategic implications of viral content and public attention that she had spent 40 years avoiding through careful privacy management and deliberate cultivation of a low public profile. "I suppose my days of flying incognito are officially over," she observed with resignation that was only partially genuine. "The Royal Charity Gala Committee has been fielding inquiries from international media outlets who want to cover your speech tonight," Marcus continued, understanding that Grace's appearance at the event would now carry additional significance, given the morning's demonstration of her values under pressure. "They're particularly interested in your perspective on dignity, respect, and corporate responsibility." The mention of the gala brought Grace's attention to the evening's primary purpose, reminding her that this annual journey to London had always been about honoring her late husband's memory while supporting charitable causes that reflected their shared values about education, opportunity, and social justice. Tonight's event would provide an opportunity to address themes that had been dramatically illustrated by her confrontation with Victoria Blackwood. "Has there been any word about Mrs. Blackwood's planned attendance at the gala?" Grace asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and was asking more for confirmation than information. Marcus's expression carried the kind of professional satisfaction that came from watching problematic situations resolve themselves through natural consequences, rather than requiring direct intervention. Mrs. Blackwood's invitation was formally rescinded approximately 3 hours ago, citing reputational concerns and the potential for disruption to the evening's charitable mission. The committee felt that her presence would detract from the event's focus on education and opportunity. The limousine that carried them through London's early evening traffic was appointed with communication equipment that kept Grace connected to her global business operations. allowing her to monitor the ongoing consequences of the morning's incident while preparing for an evening that would transform her annual private memorial into a very public statement about values, dignity, and corporate responsibility. The Blackwood estate situation is proceeding according to your instructions, Marcus reported, consulting his tablet for updates from their legal and financial teams. The insurance reviews have revealed significant issues with policy compliance, particularly regarding the morality clauses that Mrs. Blackwood apparently never bothered to read or understand. Grace nodded with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from watching carefully constructed business strategies produce desired results through legitimate channels rather than personal vengeance or arbitrary punishment. I want to ensure that our response is proportionate and focused on protecting our business interests rather than simply punishing someone for revealing their character so publicly. The legal team has recommended freezing the more problematic assets while conducting a thorough review of the estate's compliance with all policy requirements, Marcus explained. This approach allows us to address legitimate business concerns while giving Mrs. Blackwood an opportunity to demonstrate whether she's capable of learning from this experience and modifying her behavior accordingly. The Victoria and Albert Museum appeared through the limousine windows as they approached the venue for the evening's gala, its illuminated facade suggesting the kind of cultural significance and social importance that made this one of London's most prestigious charitable events. Tonight, Grace Washington would deliver a keynote address to an audience that included members of the royal family, heads of major corporations, and leaders from charitable organizations around the world. Mrs. Washington, Marcus said as they prepared to enter the museum, "I should mention that the speech you prepared for tonight has generated significant advance interest, particularly given this morning's events. People are eager to hear your perspective on dignity, respect, and the responsibilities that come with wealth and influence." Grace adjusted her evening gown, a midnight blue creation that was elegant without being ostentatious, understanding that her appearance tonight would be scrutinized by people who were trying to reconcile the modest woman in the cardigan from the viral video with the corporate titan who controlled one of the world's most successful airlines and investment companies. Marcus Grace said as they prepared to enter the gala, "I think tonight's speech needs to address something more important than corporate responsibility or charitable giving. It needs to address the question of how we treat people when we think no one important is watching, and what that reveals about our character as individuals and as a society." The evening ahead would transform Grace Washington from a private executive into a public symbol of the values she had been quietly promoting for 40 years, turning her annual memorial to her late husband into a platform for discussing themes that had been dramatically illustrated by her encounter with Victoria Blackwood's prejudice and entitlement. The Victoria and Albert Museum had been transformed into a glittering showcase of British high society, with hundreds of the most influential people in London gathered beneath soaring Gothic arches that had witnessed countless historical moments, but perhaps none quite as significant as what was about to unfold. Grace Washington stood backstage reviewing notes for a speech that had been completely rewritten during the flight from New York, understanding that her words tonight would reach far beyond the assembled guests to a global audience following her story through social media and news coverage. The introduction came from Lord Pemberton, chairman of the Royal Charity Trust, whose voice carried the kind of aristocratic authority that had been shaped by centuries of privilege, but tempered by genuine respect for someone whose accomplishments transcended social class and inherited position. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present someone who has demonstrated that true nobility comes from character, rather than title wisdom, rather than wealth and dignity, rather than designer clothing." Grace walked onto the stage to thunderous applause that seemed to echo through the museum's ancient halls, with the force of social vindication, each clap representing recognition that the morning's viral incident had revealed something important about the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. She stood at the podium wearing her midnight blue gown with the confidence of someone who had learned that real authority came from a lifetime of making decisions that helped other people rather than simply enriching herself. Your Royal Highnesses, distinguished guests and friends. Grace began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall without amplification, demonstrating the kind of natural authority that comes from decades of commanding attention through competence rather than volume. Tonight, we gather to support educational opportunities for young people who dream of futures that their current circumstances make seem impossible. The opening words established the evening's charitable purpose while creating a thematic connection to the morning's events that everyone in the audience understood, without explicit reference to the viral video that had brought global attention to Grace's values and character under pressure. This morning I had an experience that reminded me of something my late husband Samuel used to say about the difference between looking important and being important. Grace continued, her voice taking on the reflective tone of someone sharing wisdom that had been gained through personal loss and professional challenge. Samuel believed that you could judge someone's character by observing how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them in return. The audience listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood they were hearing something more significant than typical charity gala remarks. Recognizing that Grace was using this platform to address themes that had been dramatically illustrated by her confrontation with Victoria Blackwood's prejudice and entitlement. Today, someone judged my worth based on my appearance and made assumptions about my value as a human being based on my clothing rather than my character, Grace said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had transformed a personal attack into a teachable moment about dignity and respect. She saw an elderly black woman in a simple cardigan and concluded that I didn't belong in first class, that my presence somehow diminished her experience of luxury and exclusivity. The silence in the hall was so complete that the only sounds were the gentle rustle of expensive fabric and the distant hum of London traffic outside the museum walls, as 800 of the most privileged people in British society listened to someone describe the kind of discrimination that most of them had never experienced, but many of them had undoubtedly witnessed without intervention. What that person didn't understand. Grace continued, her voice strengthening as she reached the heart of her message, is that true first-class treatment isn't about excluding people who don't meet your social standards. It's about including everyone with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves, regardless of their appearance, background, or economic circumstances. The statement drew sustained applause that seemed to build organically as people throughout the hall recognized the moral clarity and practical wisdom of what Grace was saying. Understanding that she was articulating principles that went far beyond airline customer service to address fundamental questions about how society should function. The young woman who served as flight attendant during this morning's incident demonstrated more genuine class and professional excellence than someone who spent $12,000 on a ticket but couldn't spend a moment considering the humanity of the person sitting beside her. Grace observed her words carrying the kind of moral authority that made it impossible to argue with her conclusions. Which brings me to tonight's purpose, and this year's charitable mission, Grace said, transitioning from personal narrative to philanthropic vision, with the smooth efficiency of someone who understood how to connect emotional impact to practical action. Education is the most powerful force for breaking down the barriers that divide us, for helping people understand that human worth cannot be measured by bank accounts or social position. She gestured toward the audience with the inclusive warmth of someone who understood that real leadership meant inspiring others to join important causes, rather than simply demanding their support through guilt or obligation. Everyone in this room has benefited from educational opportunities that shaped our thinking, expanded our horizons, and gave us tools for contributing meaningfully to society. Tonight, we have the chance to provide those same opportunities to young people who are just as intelligent and determined as we were, but who face obstacles that we never had to overcome. I'm announcing tonight that Robinson Holdings will be establishing the Samuel Washington Memorial Scholarship Fund with an initial endowment of £50 million dedicated to providing university education for students from underrepresented communities who demonstrate academic excellence and a commitment to treating others with dignity and respect. Grace declared, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found a way to honor her husband's memory while creating lasting positive change. The announcement drew the evening's longest and loudest applause, with people throughout the hall rising to their feet in recognition of both the generosity of the gift and the values it represented. Grace stood at the podium, acknowledging their appreciation while understanding that this moment represented the transformation of her annual private memorial into a very public commitment to the principles that had guided her marriage and her career. Samuel Washington believed that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and prejudice. Grace concluded, her voice carrying the emotional weight of 40 years spent missing someone who had shaped her understanding of what really mattered in life. Tonight, we honor his memory by ensuring that young people who share his values will have opportunities to build futures that serve their communities and strengthen our shared humanity. The standing ovation that followed seemed to last forever, creating a moment of shared commitment to values that transcended social class, national boundaries, and cultural differences, while establishing Grace Washington as a global symbol of dignity, wisdom, and the kind of leadership that inspired others to become better versions of themselves. The fluorescent lights of the Newark Airport budget car rental facility cast a harsh glare that made everything look slightly green and deeply unforgiving, creating the kind of institutional atmosphere that seemed designed to remind people that they had fallen far from whatever heights they might have once occupied. Victoria Blackwood stood behind the Formica counter wearing a polyester uniform that hung loosely on her frame, having lost considerable weight during a year of financial stress and social isolation that had transformed her from a pampered socialite into someone who understood the daily grind of service work. Her name tag read Vicky, a diminutive she had never used during her years of inherited wealth, but which seemed more appropriate for someone whose primary job responsibilities included explaining to frustrated travelers why their reserved convertible wasn't available and why upgrading to a mid-size sedan would cost an additional $49 per day. The manicured nails and designer accessories that had once signaled her elevated social status had been replaced by the practical considerations of someone who needed to count every dollar and couldn't afford to waste money on appearances that no longer served any functional purpose. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but had unfolded with the slow inevitability of financial gravity reasserting itself after the artificial buoyancy of inherited wealth had been systematically removed by people who understood how to dismantle complex financial structures with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness. The insurance policy cancellations had led to asset freezes, which had triggered loan calls, which had necessitated fire sale liquidations that turned millions in theoretical wealth into thousands in actual cash. Ma'am, I understand you're upset about the vehicle class, but this is what we have available, Victoria said to the red-faced businessman who was currently expressing his displeasure with the kind of entitled fury that she recognized from her own behavior exactly 1 year ago. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now on the receiving end of exactly the kind of treatment she had once dispensed to service workers who had failed to meet her expectations for special accommodation. The businessman slammed his credit card onto the counter with enough force to make Victoria flinch, triggering memories of her own aggressive behavior toward airline employees and customer service representatives who had been trying to do their jobs while she demanded preferential treatment based on her perceived social importance. "Do you know who I am?" he shouted, apparently believing that his identity would somehow create additional rental cars out of thin air. Victoria's response was shaped by 12 months of experience on the other side of customer service interactions, giving her insights into how meaningless such questions really were when you were dealing with practical limitations that couldn't be resolved through intimidation or social positioning. "Sir, regardless of who you are, we only have the vehicles that are physically present in our lot, and no amount of shouting is going to change what's available today." The year of working in service industries had taught Victoria lessons about human nature and social dynamics that her previous life of inherited privilege had completely insulated her from understanding. She had learned that most people treated service workers with casual disrespect, that customers often blamed employees for problems that were completely beyond their control, and that the majority of interpersonal conflicts in commercial settings arose from unrealistic expectations rather than actual service failures. Through the window behind the customer service counter, Victoria could see the departure gates where well-dressed travelers were boarding flights to destinations that she could no longer afford to visit, heading to business meetings and social events that were part of a world she had been expelled from through her own choices and behavior. The sight no longer filled her with the desperate resentment that had characterized the early months of her financial collapse, but it did serve as a daily reminder of how quickly circumstance could change when character flaws collided with real consequences. A group of airline crew members walked past the rental counter, their uniforms crisp and professional, their conversation animated with the kind of camaraderie that came from working together as part of something larger than individual concerns. Victoria recognized the Horizon Airways insignia on their luggage and felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she remembered the morning that had changed the entire trajectory of her life through a series of choices that seemed incomprehensible in retrospect. Leading the group was Captain Rodriguez, looking exactly as composed and authoritative as he had during their confrontation 12 months earlier, engaged in conversation with a young woman whose flight attendant uniform bore the gold stripes that indicated supervisory responsibility. Victoria realized with a start that it was Maya Peterson, the flight attendant, who had tried unsuccessfully to mediate their conflict and who had apparently been promoted during the intervening year. Maya happened to glance toward the rental car counter as they passed, and Victoria saw the moment of recognition flash across her face as she processed the transformation from entitled first-class passenger to uniformed service worker. The expression that followed wasn't triumph or satisfaction, but rather a kind of sad understanding of how precipitously people could fall when their lives were built on unstable foundations. Captain Rodriguez followed Maya's gaze and also recognized Victoria, his expression cycling through surprise concern, and finally something that looked like professional compassion for someone who had learned difficult lessons through harsh experience rather than wise mentorship. There was no anger in his face, no vindictive pleasure in seeing someone who had once threatened his job and insulted his employer reduced to working in a budget rental facility. Victoria found herself unable to maintain eye contact with people who had witnessed her at her worst and who were now seeing her in circumstances that reflected the natural consequences of behavior that had revealed fundamental flaws in her character and judgment. She turned back to her computer terminal, focusing on processing rental agreements and inventory management, rather than confronting the emotions that came from seeing people who represented the life she had lost through her own choices. The evening shift at Newark Airport stretched ahead of her like a long road through familiar but unwelcoming territory, filled with frustrated travelers who would test her patience and customer service skills while she tried to maintain professional composure and remember that every interaction was an opportunity to practice the kind of dignity and respect that she had failed to show others when positions were reversed, and she had held the power to make someone else's day better or worse. Victoria Blackwood had learned that true poverty wasn't about lacking money, but about lacking the respect and consideration that she had once taken for granted. Understanding finally that the service workers she had once dismissed as unimportant were actually the foundation that made everyone else's convenience and comfort possible. The lesson had come at a price that included everything she had once valued, but it had also provided an education in human dignity that money could never have purchased and privilege had actively prevented her from acquiring. As she processed another rental agreement for another frustrated customer, Victoria found herself thinking about Grace Washington and wondering whether someone who had demonstrated such profound wisdom and strategic thinking might eventually be willing to consider that a year of consequences had taught lessons that a lifetime of privilege had failed to provide. The Horizon Airways boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Manhattan headquarters building offered a panoramic view of the city skyline that stretched from the Hudson River to the East River, providing a visual reminder of the scope and scale of what Grace Washington had built from the wreckage of a failing airline 4 decades earlier. The weekly executive meeting was proceeding with the kind of focused efficiency that characterized an organization where everyone understood that their decisions affected millions of passengers and thousands of employees around the world. The Dignity in Flight initiative has exceeded all of our projected outcomes, reported Sarah Kim, who had been promoted from first officer to vice president of customer experience following her outstanding performance in implementing new training protocols that emphasized respect and inclusion throughout the passenger experience. Customer satisfaction scores have increased by 23% across all service categories, and employee satisfaction surveys indicate that crew members feel more confident and empowered to address difficult situations while maintaining company values. Grace listened to this report with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing abstract principles transformed into concrete results that improved people's daily experiences. Understanding that the viral incident with Victoria Blackwood had created an opportunity to institutionalize changes that might have taken years to implement through normal corporate channels. More importantly, Sarah continued consulting her tablet for specific data points. We've documented a 47% reduction in passenger complaints related to discriminatory treatment, and our crew training programs are being studied by other airlines as a model for how to address bias and prejudice in customer service interactions. The success of these initiatives represented vindication of Grace's long-standing belief that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally correct, but also strategically smart for businesses that depended on public trust and customer loyalty. The year following the Victoria Blackwood incident had demonstrated that corporate values could be more than marketing slogans if they were supported by systematic training, clear policies, and leadership that was willing to enforce standards, even when it meant losing customers who refused to treat other people with basic respect. Maya Peterson's promotion to Director of Crew Development has been particularly successful, Grace observed, remembering the young flight attendant whose professional handling of an impossible situation had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership potential that deserved recognition and advancement. Her first-hand experience with the challenges that crew members face when dealing with difficult passengers has informed training programs that are both practical and effective. Maya had used her experience from the Victoria Blackwood incident to develop role-playing scenarios that prepared flight attendants and gate agents for situations involving discriminatory behavior, entitled passengers, and conflicts that required de-escalation while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Her programs had become so successful that other airlines were requesting permission to adapt them for their own training purposes. The Samuel Washington Memorial Scholarship Fund has distributed its first round of awards, reported Marcus Chen, who had transitioned from passenger to board member following Grace's recognition of his strategic thinking and commitment to educational equity. 50 students from underrepresented communities are beginning university studies this year with full funding for 4-year programs in fields ranging from aerospace engineering to hospitality management. The scholarship program had attracted applications from around the world with selection criteria that emphasized academic achievement, community service, and demonstrated commitment to treating others with dignity and respect. Grace had insisted that recipients write essays about times when they had witnessed or experienced discrimination and how those experiences had shaped their understanding of social justice and personal responsibility. I've been particularly impressed by the quality of the application essays, Grace noted, having personally read every submission despite the administrative burden it represented. These young people have already demonstrated remarkable insight into how privilege and prejudice affect human relationships, and I'm confident they'll use their educational opportunities to create positive change in their communities and professions. The transformation of a single incident into a comprehensive program for social change represented exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had made Grace Washington legendary in business circles for her ability to turn challenges into opportunities and setbacks into platforms for advancement. The Victoria Blackwood confrontation had provided a teachable moment that reached millions of people through viral video sharing, but the lasting impact would come from institutional changes that outlived any individual incident or social media cycle. Captain Rodriguez's promotion to chief pilot has allowed him to implement company-wide protocols for handling passenger conflicts. Grace continued reviewing the systematic changes that had emerged from the lessons learned during Flight 847. His experience managing the situation while maintaining safety and professionalism has informed new procedures that protect both crew members and passengers, while ensuring that company values are upheld consistently across all operations. James Rodriguez had used his elevated position to create training programs that emphasized the connection between safety protocols and dignity standards, demonstrating that respect for human worth wasn't just a nice ideological position but a practical necessity for maintaining the kind of trust and cooperation that kept commercial aviation functioning effectively. The annual anniversary flight has become an important tradition for our company. Grace reflected, thinking about the symbolic significance of continuing to take the same route that she had originally planned as a honeymoon with her late husband Samuel. This year's flight will include scholarship recipients, crew members who have demonstrated exceptional commitment to our values, and business partners who share our vision of what commercial aviation can become when it prioritizes human dignity. The anniversary flight had evolved from Grace's private memorial journey into a corporate celebration of values and achievements that honored Samuel Washington's memory while demonstrating the company's ongoing commitment to treating every passenger with respect and consideration. The guest list included people whose stories illustrated the positive impact of implementing dignity-based policies in practical business operations. Looking forward, Grace said, turning her attention to strategic planning that would extend the influence of their initiatives beyond the aviation industry. I want to explore partnerships with hospitality companies, retail organizations, and other service industries that could benefit from similar training programs and policy frameworks. The success of Horizon Airways' dignity initiatives had attracted attention from business leaders in other industries who recognized that customer service excellence required more than technical competence and efficiency. It required cultural change that valued human relationships over transactional interactions and long-term trust over short-term profit optimization. Mrs. Washington. Sarah Kim said, I should mention that we've received a letter from Victoria Blackwood requesting an opportunity to apologize in person and discuss whether there might be any possibility of making amends for her behavior last year. Grace considered this information with the kind of thoughtful attention that she gave to all decisions that involved human relationships and second chances, understanding that her response would communicate something important about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of genuine transformation following serious mistakes and their consequences. The conference room at the International Civil Aviation Organization headquarters in Montreal buzzed with the kind of focused energy that accompanied discussions about policies that would affect millions of travelers around the world, as representatives from 53 countries gathered to address passenger rights, anti-discrimination protocols, and the enforcement mechanisms that would ensure commercial aviation served all passengers with equal dignity and respect. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the organization's Director of Passenger Rights, stood before a wall-sized display showing statistics from airlines that had implemented dignity-based training programs following the widely publicized Victoria Blackwood incident, which had become known in aviation circles as the Seat 1A case, and was now studied in business schools as an example of how viral social media content could drive corporate policy changes. The data we've collected over the past 12 months demonstrates that dignity-based customer service training produces measurable improvements in passenger satisfaction, crew confidence, and incident resolution across all demographic categories. Dr. Rodriguez reported highlighting charts that showed consistent improvement patterns across airlines that had adopted similar programs. More significantly, these improvements appear to be sustainable rather than temporary, suggesting that cultural change is occurring rather than simple compliance with new regulations. The presentation represented a transformation of individual corporate initiative into industry-wide policy recommendations that would establish minimum standards for how airlines addressed discrimination, harassment, and conflicts involving passenger behavior. Grace Washington's response to Victoria Blackwood's prejudice had created a template that other companies could adapt for their specific circumstances and operational requirements. The Horizon Airways model has been particularly influential because it demonstrates that treating passengers with dignity isn't just ethically correct, but also commercially successful, Dr. Rodriguez continued showing financial data that indicated increased customer loyalty, reduced legal liability, and improved employee retention among airlines that had implemented comprehensive dignity training programs. Companies that have adopted similar approaches report higher profitability alongside improved social impact metrics. Representatives from major airlines around the world had been studying the protocols that Grace Washington had developed, recognizing that the business case for dignity-based policies was as compelling as the moral argument. The viral video of Victoria Blackwood's removal had created public expectations for how airlines should handle discriminatory behavior, making it commercially necessary for companies to demonstrate clear policies and consistent enforcement. Professor Michael Thompson from Harvard Business School had been conducting longitudinal research on the social and economic impacts of the incident, tracking how a single confrontation had influenced corporate policies, employee training programs, and consumer expectations across multiple industries beyond aviation. What we're observing is a phenomenon where viral social media content creates immediate pressure for institutional change. But the lasting impact depends on whether organizations use the attention to implement systematic reforms rather than simply managing short-term public relations challenges. Professor Thompson explained to a gathering of business leaders studying the case as an example of crisis management and strategic transformation. His research had documented how companies in hospitality, retail, and other service industries had voluntarily adopted similar training programs and policy frameworks, recognizing that consumer attitudes about discrimination and dignity were changing in ways that required proactive response rather than reactive damage control when incidents occurred. The Victoria Blackwood incident had become required reading in corporate ethics courses, social justice seminars, and leadership development programs because it illustrated multiple important principles about power dynamics, privilege, consequences, and the intersection of individual behavior with institutional accountability. Students consistently identify this case as transformative for their understanding of how personal prejudices can have far-reaching consequences in interconnected business environments, reported Dr. Jennifer Liu from the Wharton School, where the case was used in courses on business ethics, crisis management, and organizational behavior. The fact that Mrs. Blackwood's assumptions about social hierarchies led directly to her financial ruin provides a concrete illustration of how character failures can undermine material success. Legal scholars had also found the case valuable for discussions about discrimination law, corporate liability, and the enforcement mechanisms that could address individual misconduct through business relationships rather than criminal or civil proceedings. Grace Washington's use of insurance policies and financial agreements to create accountability had provided a new model for addressing behavior that harmed individuals but might not rise to the level of criminal prosecution. The Samuel Washington Memorial Scholarship Fund had expanded beyond its original scope to include partnerships with universities around the world, creating educational opportunities for students who demonstrated both academic excellence and commitment to promoting dignity and respect in their future careers and communities. The scholarship recipients are already making significant contributions to their universities and communities, reported Dr. Amanda Foster, the fund's academic director. Their essays and research projects consistently address themes related to social justice inclusion and the practical implementation of dignity-based policies in various professional contexts. The scholarship program had attracted additional funding from corporations and individuals who wanted to support educational initiatives that promoted social change through leadership development and academic achievement. The annual Scholarship Symposium had become an important gathering for business leaders, academics, and students interested in exploring how dignity-based principles could be applied across different industries and cultural contexts. Victoria Blackwood's request for a meeting with Grace Washington had sparked discussions among business ethicists about forgiveness redemption and the conditions under which second chances should be offered to people who had demonstrated serious character failures but appeared to have learned from the consequences of their behavior. The question isn't whether Mrs. Blackwood deserves forgiveness, observed Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in business ethics and restorative justice, but whether offering that opportunity serves the broader goal of encouraging genuine transformation and demonstrating that dignity-based policies include pathways for redemption alongside accountability for harmful behavior. The debate reflected broader social questions about how institutions should balance justice with mercy, consequences with rehabilitation, and protection of vulnerable people with opportunities for personal growth and change. Grace Washington's decision about whether to meet with Victoria Blackwood would communicate important messages about the values that should guide both individual relationships and institutional policies in addressing discrimination and prejudice. The private dining room at the Harvard Club overlooked Central Park in the golden hour before sunset, its windows framing autumn leaves that seemed to glow with the kind of light that transformed ordinary moments into memories worth preserving. Grace Washington sat across from Victoria Blackwood at a small table set for two, the formal china and silver, creating a stark contrast to their last meeting in the cramped aisle of an aircraft, where power dynamics and social assumptions had collided with devastating consequences for both women. Victoria had aged considerably during the 18 months since their confrontation, her face bearing the kind of lines that come from genuine hardship rather than cosmetic procedures, her simple black dress and minimal jewelry suggesting someone who had learned to find dignity in simplicity rather than demanding it through expensive displays. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, betraying the nervous energy of someone who understood that this conversation would determine whether redemption was possible or whether some mistakes created permanent consequences. Mrs. Washington. Victoria began, her voice carrying none of the entitled authority that had characterized her behavior on Flight 847, replaced instead by the careful humility of someone who had learned to measure words and consider their impact before speaking. I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me, even though I have no right to expect your time or attention after what I did to you. Grace studied Victoria's face with the careful attention of someone who had spent 40 years learning to distinguish between genuine remorse and strategic performance, recognizing the subtle differences between people who regretted getting caught and people who regretted their choices. Victoria, I agreed to this meeting because I believe in the possibility of transformation, but also because I want to understand whether your experience has taught you something meaningful about dignity, respect, and how we treat each other as human beings. The question hung between them like a bridge that Victoria would either cross toward genuine understanding or fail to recognize as the opportunity for redemption that it represented. She took a deep breath, gathering courage that had been earned through months of working in service industries and experiencing firsthand the casual cruelty that privileged people often inflicted on those they perceived as socially inferior. I've learned that everything I thought I knew about worth and value was wrong, Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of admitting fundamental errors in judgment that had shaped years of destructive behavior. I spent my entire marriage and widowhood believing that money made me important, that my husband's achievements made me accomplished, and that my social position gave me the right to judge other people's humanity based on their appearance or circumstances. Grace nodded slowly, recognizing the kind of insight that could only come from experiencing both sides of power dynamics and understanding how arbitrary and fragile social hierarchies really were when subjected to the test of character and consequences. What I understand now, Victoria continued, is that treating someone with dignity shouldn't depend on knowing their bank balance or their social position, and that the cruelest thing I did to you wasn't questioning your right to sit in first class, but refusing to see your humanity because it didn't match my prejudices about what important people should look like. 5 years after the incident that transformed both their lives, Grace Washington and Victoria Blackwood stood together at the annual Samuel Washington Memorial Scholarship Ceremony, their unlikely partnership serving as a living testament to the possibility of redemption, forgiveness, and the kind of transformation that occurs when consequences meet genuine remorse and produce lasting change. The ballroom at the Four Seasons was filled with scholarship recipients, their families, and corporate sponsors who had committed to supporting educational opportunities for young people who demonstrated both academic excellence and dedication to treating others with dignity and respect. Victoria had spent the past 3 years working as Director of Guest Relations Training for a hotel chain that specialized in serving diverse clientele, using her experience of falling from privilege to powerlessness to develop programs that taught hospitality workers how to provide excellent service while maintaining their own dignity and professional boundaries. Her transformation from entitled socialite to effective advocate for service workers had surprised everyone, including herself, demonstrating that people could indeed learn from their mistakes if the consequences were severe enough, and the motivation for change was genuine rather than superficial. The scholarship fund had grown from Grace's original £50 million endowment to over $200 million through contributions from individuals and corporations who wanted to support the values that the program represented, creating educational opportunities for thousands of students around the world while establishing dignity-based principles as practical guides for business operations and personal relationships. Recipients were selected not only for academic achievement but for essays demonstrating understanding of social justice, personal experiences with discrimination or privilege, and commitment to using their education to create positive change in their communities and professions. Maya Peterson had been promoted to Senior Vice President of Global Operations for Horizon Airways, overseeing customer experience initiatives that had become industry standards for how airlines should handle passenger conflicts, crew training, and the integration of dignity-based policies with safety protocols and operational efficiency. Her programs were studied by business schools, government agencies, and international organizations as examples of how individual incidents could be transformed into comprehensive institutional change that served both moral principles and practical business objectives. The ripple effects of that single confrontation on Flight 847 had extended far beyond the aviation industry to influence corporate policies. Educational curricula and social conversations about privilege, prejudice, and the responsibilities that came with wealth and power. Business schools taught the Victoria Blackwood case as an example of how character failures could undermine material success, while social justice organizations used Grace Washington's response as a model for how to address discrimination through strategic action rather than angry reaction. Captain Rodriguez had retired as chief pilot after implementing company-wide protocols that balanced passenger rights with crew authority, safety requirements with dignity standards, and corporate liability with moral responsibility, leaving behind training programs that prepared aviation professionals to handle conflicts involving discrimination, entitlement, and the complex dynamics that arose when people from different backgrounds shared confined spaces for extended periods. Victoria's annual speech to new scholarship recipients had become one of the ceremony's most powerful traditions, offering young people a first-hand account of how privilege could corrupt judgment, how consequences could create opportunities for growth, and how redemption required genuine change rather than simple apology or financial compensation. Her message consistently emphasized that treating people with dignity wasn't about political correctness or social expectations, but about recognizing the fundamental humanity that connected all people regardless of their circumstances or appearances. The legal precedents established by Grace's response to Victoria's behavior had influenced corporate liability standards. Insurance policy, language and enforcement mechanisms that allowed business relationships to address individual misconduct without requiring criminal prosecution or civil litigation, creating accountability systems that were both effective and proportionate to the severity of harmful behavior. Research conducted by universities and policy institutes had documented measurable improvements in customer satisfaction, employee retention, and corporate reputation among organizations that had implemented dignity-based training programs, providing concrete evidence that treating people with respect produced tangible business benefits alongside moral satisfaction. The data had convinced skeptical executives that investing in dignity training was strategically smart rather than merely ethically correct. International aviation organizations had incorporated dignity standards into recommended policies for member airlines, creating global frameworks that established minimum expectations for how passengers should be treated regardless of their ticket price destination or apparent social status. Transforming individual corporate initiative into industry-wide cultural change that affected millions of travelers annually. The Samuel Washington Memorial Foundation had expanded beyond scholarships to include research grants for studying discrimination policy development initiatives for implementing dignity-based practices in various industries and advocacy programs that connected academic research with practical applications in business, government, and nonprofit organizations. The Foundation's annual conference had become an important gathering for business leaders, educators, policymakers, and activists who shared commitment to creating more inclusive and respectful social institutions. As Grace Washington looked around the ballroom filled with young people whose educational opportunities had been made possible by transforming a moment of ugliness into lasting positive change, she felt the presence of her late husband Samuel and understood that their delayed honeymoon journey had finally been completed through work that honored his memory while creating the kind of world they had dreamed of building together. The empty seat that had once represented Victoria Blackwood's absence from the London Gala now symbolized the space that had been created for genuine transformation, redemption, and the ongoing possibility that people could learn to see each other's humanity clearly enough to build relationships based on dignity rather than hierarchy, character rather than wealth, and shared values rather than artificial divisions that served no one's legitimate interests. If this story of justice transformation and the power of treating everyone with dignity moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share your thoughts in the comments about how small acts of kindness or courage have changed your perspective, and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Together we can build communities where everyone is valued for their character rather than their circumstances, and where true class is measured by how we treat others rather than how others treat us.